very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for keeping it to NBS television. I hope you are having a beautiful Sunday to yourselves. There is a lot of online praying. I hope you did go to church online through your TV or through any other channels that have been provided already. Thank you so much for joining us. At this particular time, we will be having a great discussion. We know well that COVID-19 is still on. Listening to the news, the millions and millions who are still getting infected. Uganda so far has confirmed about 3 deaths out of COVID-19 and thousands others who have been infected across Uganda, but also across the world. There are hundreds of thousands who have been infected. Now, because of this pandemic that has swept across the world, there had to be a number of changes that did have to come through to ensure that they do curb, the different governments do curb the continued spread of COVID-19. In Uganda particularly, the President and the Ministry of Health did release a number of guidelines. Adverse of all was the total lockdown, where we had a total lockdown, especially of non-essential services. We had just a few essential services that were in operation. And slowly by slowly, we continue to see that, yes, the opening up is starting, but a number of businesses have been affected. There are lots and lots of rent arrears that have to be dealt with, operational costs that are still going up, lots of employee relations that are between, employer-employee relations that have fallen. We know that so many people that have lost their jobs. That is very, very unfortunate. Others have had to take pay cuts. But the fact is that COVID-19 is still here with us. How do we get to adhere to the guidelines, especially well knowing that there are pre-existent laws in the country that need to be followed? Whereas an employer is being hard hit by COVID-19, we clearly know that there are laws that have to be followed. Even if they're to terminate services of an employee, there are a lot of laws that have to be adhered to and taken into consideration. But also, as we continue, we know that many employers are facing it hard, especially in realizing the kind of profits that they did have to realize prior that could make them deal with their running operational costs. And now that cannot be realized. There is a lot of love-hate relationships that are existent between the employers and the employees. How do we get to ensure that that is amended? But also on the side of government, is there a stimulus package? How is it going to ensure that it revives? It's not only paying attention to the business owners, but also, like the economists have continuously said, both the demand and supply sides are actually dealt with. That conversation today is brought to us by the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, ISER, particularly with the theme, Promoting Responsible Business for Economic Recovery. We know that the world has been hit hard, and not only Uganda. How do we recover from this without having to hurt each other? That's the discussion that we are going to be having right about this afternoon in the studios. And with me, starting from my extreme left, is none other than the economist himself. He needs not as much introduction as possible, Mr. Ramadan Gobi from Makerere University Business Schools. It's a pleasure having you, Mr. Ramadan Gobi.
Thank you, Mary. It's also a pleasure to be here.
And he's always broken down the economic terms much simpler on to the people who are watching. I also have Mr. Alex Asimwe once again. We get to meet. He's a Commissioner, Labor, Productivity and Industrial Relations in a ministry I love to call Ministry of Everyone. That's a Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. Mr. Alex Asimwe, welcome and good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mildred.
Good afternoon to you. And I do have Connie Kakikembo, who is the Chief Executive Officer of UWIL, and she will be speaking to us about employee relations and the perspective that employers need to take to ensure that there is productivity, but also that laws are adhered to. Connie, it's a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, and nice to meet you.
A pleasure is mine. Mr. Arnold Kwesiga, who is the coordinator, Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability. I love the last word. Accountability is very key in our economy. A pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much, Mildred, and good afternoon, our viewers.
And of course, we're going to have a very fruitful discussion. Please follow in on our social media handles at NBS TV, that's on Twitter, NBS Television on Facebook, and Next Media Services on YouTube. You can also watch us on Periscope on Twitter and also be able to watch us live on our YouTube as well as our Facebook. I'll start off with you, Mr. Alex Asimwe. we know that with the closure, especially of the non-essential workers, there's been a lot happening, lots of costs that have accrued. And for many of the business owners, they have thought that the best way possible to still stay up and running is to cut costs by either laying off workers or having their salaries cut. Some of these salary deductions have not come with a prior discussion between the employers and the employees. How has COVID-19 affected the employment relationships?
Okay, thank you, Mildred. First, I would like to thank the President of this country for his strategic leadership in national response to COVID-19, and particularly for measures that have been taken to stop the spread of this disease. Now, Mildred, you need to understand that COVID has affected both employees and employers in equal measure. But also, there are substantial benefits or positive impacts that we have seen in this period, where the majority of businesses are struggling to survive, others are making actually serious profits. This COVID has revealed to this country an untapped potential on import substitution capacity. Every time government of Uganda emphasizes the import substitution strategy, but many Ugandans, or some Ugandans, may not understand what it means. So this has been revealed that actually we can survive and stand on our own. We have seen over 38 factories making sanitizers, making PPEs, coming up and employing people. But also, we have seen very serious creativity and innovation coming up. Recently, I used to move to restaurants to have, my meal, lunch.
Yes.
No, I just order and everything will be delivered. E-marketing. And we see many innovations coming up, in order to comply with what we call the lockdown measures. Now, it's true that whereas others are gaining and are laughing because of the production capacity they have, engaged in, there are also negative impacts that we have seen, as you stated. The job losses, we have seen some, employers, particularly in hotel and transport, because they want to reduce what we call employee costs. They have undertaken serious measures of salary cuts. Others, have been laid off. We have also seen some workers being terminated.
Yeah.
So that is a negative impact. But broadly, when you analyze that, you find other serious negative impacts that, that really, and I will talk about how government is responding to those negative impacts, like reduced labor productivity. We know very well that the lockdown measures has brought in the curfew hours. Others, work from home. Others have been stopped completely, particularly those that are in the leisure industry, like spa.
Yes, yes.
Until recently, the saloons were not working. So in terms of productivity, it has gone down. And this is also an issue that we're crumbling with, the working time. Ugandans, when you look at the UBO statistics reports, the labor force survey and manpower survey, on average, Ugandans work for about 7 hours, 7.3 hours. But between me and you, when you look at countries that have developed, they work average 13 hours. We have seen that the informal sector, they use it to work according to the statistics, about 10.1 hours. But now we have seen informal sector, because of the lockdown measures, curtailed. But also because of our creative leadership. You heard the other day the president talking about praising the informal sector workers who were able to sleep in the market. And that was to cure this negative impact of reduced labor productivity in terms of working hours. Okay. So we have also noticed an increase in the child labor incidences because of the lockdown measures in the education sector, and this data is administrative. And also we have a response to that government is undertaking. So all these lockdown measures have impacted employers and employees in equal measure. But allow me to single out 3 important aspects that employers that have not understood very clearly. Because you recall 1st May, the president guided the country that employees should not be terminated. Why? It is because termination is expensive. When you terminate, it means that you must follow a lengthy and tedious procedure. You have to follow Section 58 of Employment Act that talks about notice, Section 65, procedures of termination, Section 81 on collective termination, Regulation 44 that talks about what you need to do in terms of reorganizing and putting in place a terminal benefits payment plan. Meaning that for you to take that route, it is very, 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 very expensive. And for that matter, there are employees, there are employers that have complied with the directive of government because we issued out the guidelines. But there are those not terminated.
But we'll talk about how
yeah,
people
absolutely.
ended up being terminated.
But then there are those that have not. And I wanted to make clarification on 3 areas.
Yes.
Many employers or some employers have instituted what we call salary cuts in their enterprises. Okay. But that salary cuts, yes, the law provides for it, Section 59. When you look at, written particulars that you give to an employee, that mid-grade has been, you are appointed as a news manager, your salary is 10 million. Now, because of COVID, somebody wants to ensure that your salary is reduced to 5 million. The law provides that, yes, you can go ahead and do that, but the subsection 4 provides that before you do that, mid-grade must be aware. You must get what we call a verifiable consent or agreement that mid-grade has recognized that this company is facing a problem, and I have agreed that my salary is reduced from this percentage to this percentage. Now, many employers have not obtained what we call verifiable consent or agreement. 2, unpaid leave. We have seen many employers sending employees on account of this term unpaid leave. The Employment Act does not provide unpaid leave. But equally, lawyers normally come up and say, Alex, neither the Employment Act does not prohibit unpaid leave. But Section 23 of the Employment Act is very clear that you can only be employed under a contract of service where such terms do not conflict the Employment Act. Meaning, or it therefore follows, that an employer can proceed and negotiate with the worker on such terms and conditions that do not conflict the Employment Act. Meaning,
Viewers, you're saying unpaid leave is not under the Employment Act. It's not captured.
it is not provided.
And yet, I, as an employee, I can be able to speak to my employer and say, because I'm going for maybe study leave and you feel you won't pay me for 6 months away, I can take unpaid leave. Consider my leave unpaid, right? I can be able to. But the employer cannot be able to say, because things are not moving on very well, I think, Mildred, we can't have 10 of you. Let's remain with 3 who we can pay. The 7 of you go for unpaid leave. That cannot be captured.
It can be captured on conditions that there is that dialogue, that the employees accept that whatever decision that happens in regard to being off duty, you are part of it, but you do not see a board decision that the board has taken a decision that the following employees are going to be terminated.
But Mr. Asimo, you know that this dialogue can also be one-sided, eh? That the board can decide and take the decision and decide to just pass on the resolution, because the company is not making enough money, you people will have to go for unpaid leave. Because I expect a dialogue should be an exchange of why am I going for this, but we don't see this happening in many of these companies.
Some, actually, the issue is that, and that's why government has put up in place over 200 labor offices across the country. One of the cardinal functions of the labor office is to facilitate dialogue, or what we call social dialogue, between employers and employees, such that there is what we call a harmonious relationship at the workplace.
Okay.
So, and then the third that I wanted to talk about is what we call termination or corrective termination. So Ugandans, termination is very expensive. Termination must be done in line with the law. And it is very, very, very tedious. First of all, once you consider termination, then you must think about the terminal benefits. And that's a cost. And we do not want employers to go into that cost at this particular time when there are cheap options that have been proposed by government.
Okay. Well, we'll be coming back to those because each one has had its own way that it's been misconstrued and used anyway, and the employers have nothing to say about it. But I'll be getting back to you. I want to come to you, Mr. Ramadan Govi. Can private businesses in such times be able to survive? Because I'm looking at a time whereby, yes, there is curfew, although it was a bit extended, working hours are reduced because you have to plan for the curfew. If your journey initially took an hour, you have to plan for about 2.5 or so because you do not know what is on the road and you also don't want to be caught up. But also the borders are closed. Many of these businesses have probably been trading outside of Uganda. Can they be able to survive in such a time?
Thank you, and I thank those who invited me to this conversation. First, I think the Ministry of Finance has actually set up a COVID economic response unit.
Okay.
And I was privileged. They hired a foreign firm to analyze and define the terms of reference for this unit. But that foreign firm hired me to be part of the team. And in this analysis we have made, we have actually found that most of the things the commissioner is talking about, they are the direct opposite of what's actually is happening on the ground.
Thank you.
Businesses have faced it so rough, and as a result of that, they have found it so difficult, businesses and corporations and other organizations, to continue operating. And as a result of that, they have found it so difficult to continue employing their staff as they were operating prior to the pandemic. And unlike the directives of government, economics works differently.
Okay.
You must have the money to keep people on the payroll. Or you should have a fallback position, which a number of governments have provided in the world, because this is a global phenomenon, as we all know. In Uganda, we haven't provided for that yet. And also in the package which is coming, which the minister partially announced on the budget day, and which the team has been putting together, I don't see enough kind of anchor to support private businesses to continue operating, or actually to kind of keep the employees on their payroll. So we anticipate that about 180,000 jobs, formal ones, are going to be lost, going to be destroyed, 180,000. Using the two scenarios, one, even if the pandemic remains contained, as it has been, and they are just clusters of the virus which is affecting the country. Why? Because even if we contain it, Uganda is not an island. We are operating in the global economy, and that global economy is not working as of now. And there is a resurgence of this virus in many of our markets, which we export to, especially Europe, in the Middle East, and even where we get our foreign direct investments and portfolio money, USA. They are all facing a resurgence. But even then, we have another scenario. What if in Uganda also we get a resurgence of this virus, and the government deems it fit to reconstitute the lockdown? What would happen to the businesses? So we were analyzing those two scenarios, and we find that either way you look at it, it's almost the same result. GDP is going to reduce by at least 7% this calendar year, which means that if we had anticipated the economy to grow by 6.5% this year, we might see the economy actually shrinking, becoming smaller by 0.5%. Instead of growing, it will shrink by 0.5 calendar year. So that means by extension, the businesses will find it difficult to continue keeping people on the payroll. And something has to be done to help them. But now, what is that something, and from where? Because even the government itself needs help. As of now, there's no revenue. There is a revenue shortfall of about 2 trillion shillings. They had anticipated to collect 21 trillion this financial year. They have already downgraded that anticipation to 19 trillion. And URA is saying actually it might not even be realized itself. So with that, therefore, you find that it's a catch-22 for government and employers, and a conversation has to be made. And that's why I'm so happy for this, on what other avenues can be put in place to protect these businesses such that they are able to keep the employees on the payroll, but most importantly also to keep the livelihoods of people, because leave alone the formal jobs, the figures show we might lose up to 3 million livelihoods. You know, those which are solo proprietorships, those who are working in the informal economy, up to 3 million livelihoods. That is if we get the resurgence of the virus. If we don't, we shall have about 2 million of them already lost. UN has been in the same area of projection, IMF, same area of projection. Even UBOS, the latest figures they have, they indicate these are kind of the impact we need to grapple with.
Okay. Well, that's really, really very tight. And that's why I was saying, like you said, what Commissioner Simo is talking about may be the ideal, but it's totally working out totally different. Let's look at the women businesses, because it's very clear, Connie, that a greater percentage in the informal sector is actually taken on by the women. The women participate more in the informal sector. How have these been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, just like the men, there's a lot that has been impacted on the women entrepreneurs, particularly the women-owned businesses. There is owning a business, but you have co-ownership. And I must say that the women are stressed. They are very innovative in terms of engaging in economic activities, but they're very stressed by the pandemic. Now, I must say that the first thing is that there's increased care work. Remember when we were locked down, all of us were at home.
All was upon the women.
Whereas I had work to deliver to meet my targets as a worker, as a woman, as an entrepreneur, to deliver some items, whatever it is. I need to first care for the children. I need to care for the husband. I need to look around everybody to make sure everyone is accommodative. Now, the biggest challenges that the women entrepreneurs have faced is working on unpaid work. You spend your entire, first of all, your 4 hours in the morning running around. And in the afternoon, when you're supposed to handle or to submit your work, you have 2 hours. And the children are running to mommy many times. So that alone has impacted greatly on the economic activity of women entrepreneurs. Okay. And of course, we have been trying to encourage them to get out of the stress, to ensure that they kickstart again their businesses. But it is one of the key challenges. And it's not paid for. The care that the women do is not paid for. And we also have increasing trend that the women are taking on responsibility in the entire household. So that is one of the key things that has actually brought down the production of women enterprises, that we cannot compete anymore because of the pandemic. We were moving very well. The informal sector were encouraging them to get formal, and the numbers were growing. But right now, we can't even attain where we are as women entrepreneurs. Secondly, everyone went digital when we went in the lockdown. And that was the norm. We had to be innovative. We had to be like the rest of the people. Unfortunately, there is a digital gender divide. It's normal. Many women don't even know how to use small smartphones. So tell me how we're going to compete. We are just privileged that we are good customer care. Naturally, if you come on my stall and I'm selling my tomatoes, they will be clean, I'll convince you. But now I'm supposed to sell my tomatoes on online. And I'm not very good at that. So of course, we are now investing highly on how can we quickly catch up with the digital and bridge the gap. The gap that has been, yes, because the majority, Kampala people may be trying in the national level, but go down. Women who have the beans, who have the rice, who have all these things that we need, that we consume, they're struggling to get online.
Sure.
And that for us, it's a great impact. It has reduced innovations, and also it has also reduced the income the women are being able to, to generate at the end of the day. The other aspect I must clearly say that in terms of issues of gender-based violence have escalated. Whereas you're at home, you want to start your cottage, move away from town, and do some production. You have to make money at whatever point. As an entrepreneur, you're supposed to be innovative, to position yourself. There's need for flexibility and learning new skills. But of course, we have been locked at home. There's been, even witnessing the gender-based violence, which is even so bad. You're trying to get your few things together that you can market them and get some money. Before you know it, actually, your own husband is going out with your daughter. The big news, you have been seeing them in papers. So that is even more stressing to our own businesses. Although we are encouraging, as you will, the women to go into cottage businesses, to do something, because they need the money. And the other experience that is traumatizing the women owners of businesses is the fact that those who have money, the borders who have been dropping the items at home, are the ones taking our secondary children. So the majority is actually getting pregnant down there, and it is quiet, they can't talk. We have the norms, we can't even speak out. That has also greatly affected our negotiation powers, our competition, and also, obviously, is part and parcel of why the pandemic has even been greatly and had a negative impact to the women.
Oh, that's very true. I would like to come to the unpaid work. I know we have so many men on this panel. I don't know whether they will agree that government should legislate that even the stay-at-home mothers should start being paid by their husbands. But that's a discussion for a later stage. Arnold, Let's look at the non-essential workers. Has government done enough to protect them? Because even when the president came out to speak on Workers' Day, he clearly segmented the real economy and then what he called the leisure and pleasure economy. We've seen that hotels, whereas he's opened them, I mean, like Mr. Asimwe said, instead of walking there, I'm not even sure, even as much as they're trying, I will order and have my food at home. No one is willing to spend a night over in the hotel. After all, I can be able to sleep back home. With all this happening, do you think government is putting as much emphasis to help the non-essential workers? You saw the taxis opened, but you have to operate at 50 capacity, which becomes even much, much harder for them.
Yeah, thanks again, Mildred. And it was really good listening to the first panelists because it kind of ties into the question you're putting forward. Commissioner Alex, gave the clear government strategy, but also the legal and political framework that we have concerning employment relations, labor rights relations, and Mr. Ramadan talked about the economies, which is really good. The challenge is that it really looks broadly at the formal sector. It looks at our formal spaces of work, those that have employment contracts, that have very clear employment contracts to work. That is actually less than 20% of the workers, workers in this country. So you're dealing with 80% of informal sector workers, many of them that fall into the category you might look at non-essential workers, a lot of them working paid a day or a week or have zero contract to operate on, because we have a lot of what we call that casualization of labor. I get into an arrangement with you to do some work, and I pay you on a daily or weekly. So
Gentleman's agreement.
Yeah, exactly. And people have been doing this for years, 6 years, and it's a lot of things that you find within sectors like manufacturing and production and agribusiness, flower farms and stuff. So you have a huge group of people that survive through that kind of work, that what Commissioner Alex is providing does not actually cater for them. It would, but the struggles of actually implementing it is real. They have no contract. The Employment Act the Employment Act does not largely relate to them.
Yes.
They cannot be compensated because they have been injured. So you find the broader policy and legal framework does not assist them a lot. A lot of the discussion around even these, salary cuts or unpaid leave or paid leave of a certain period, it applies to you when you have a contract. Mildred, you've been working with me, you have a contract. We are having a negotiation on how to address the problems the company is facing, but also retain your job. It doesn't a lot come to play with a person. Even if you bring it down to my domestic help who used to come twice a week. Now there's a curfew, they are locked. I'm not paying them because they're not coming to work.
Yes.
But we might have had a contract of sort, which we knew I pay her or him monthly, and now this happened. So it's a lot of things that we see that affected so many within the informal sector, but also affected a lot that was categorized as non-essential workers. The responses that were coming from government agencies and presidential directives, you'd hear the language of dialogue. Employers and employees should dialogue, should talk this, should agree.
Dialoguing in hard times.
There are power dynamics there. Me sitting before my boss and my boss says, I think you're going to take 2-month paid leave, unpaid leave because of this and this. What are the circumstances? I say, no, I will not take that because I'm not the one who brought the pandemic. I'm ready to work.
And even if you said no, what are the circumstances that you would stay?
So we had that. So it's really, really, it's nice to say dialogue, agree. But when you work in an economy like ours, which one, collective bargaining power was broken. We don't have unions that represent, because any form of dialogue that makes sense, that is effective, will operate in a way where my union, under which I operate, the leadership comes and discusses what is going to happen to such and such employees in this sector. That is what you would call real dialogue between an employer and employees for the purpose of addressing a problem. But as long as you don't have that, it's what you started off saying, the board sits and decides, what, so-and-so should stay home, we can only retain this, or we are cutting salaries of such and such people. So you have the situation where everything that we're seeing on social media, memos being given, were not, after consultations with the employees, we have agreed to do this. It's the management has decided. So you decide what you do with it. And that is a huge, huge problem. So a lot of times, the non-essential workers that were locked out, and especially what they mentioned, the service industries. There are very many people that operate within the hospitality industries, people that operate within the service industries, people that derive a living through engagement, direct engagement. And now, but they are not essential because there was. So you got that challenge where, in addressing this pandemic, we were more focused on the public health perspective rather than the economic perspective. But the challenge that we continuously saw is that there was already a group of people that were already struggling. Those that were also categorized as non-essential were already struggling in this country. Informal sector workers were already struggling. And their situation was further, made worse by the pandemic because now they can't even do the usual trading. When you talk about even reopening and taxis, we're having discussions with people that say, I take a taxi every morning to go to town to work. On average, yes, if it's a good day, I can make 20,000 shillings and go back. But now the cost of going to town is 20,000.
Yeah.
What's the point of going there?
Thank you.
But then you look at what is in place to ensure this social and economic protection of that group of people. So it's a huge, huge challenge. And you see a lot of measures and directives that were being put in place were focused on the public health perspective, not the economic perspective. But even the discussion to say employers and employees have a dialogue. It doesn't work.
It's far-fetched.
When business people, entrepreneurs are saying, we have loans to pay, we have employees to give salary, and the responsible agencies say, negotiate with your bank to extend your loan. An extending of a loan repayment plan is not taking it away. Whether COVID is there for 8 months, I will still have to pay all this back. And so you feel that there is need for a more people-centered, like looking at the broader effect of the common person, and how do I then put in place measures that protect their ability to live, even to survive during a pandemic, but also, and for this perspective, with the economic angle to it, ensuring that businesses are supported in a way that they don't have to lay off everybody.
That's very true. Arnold, I'm going to come back to you. I want to come to you, Mr. Simwe. This is the ideal, what you talked about. I'm sorry to say, but I want to consider it the ideal. What exactly is supposed to be done? But have you as government gone down to ascertain what is happening in actual sense? Because you're talking about termination. And because I am an employer and I know when I terminate, the law may catch up with me, I decide I will not pay. It's not even a decision, but because of the economic times, I am not making the money. I've not paid you for 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 months down the road. And you as an employee don't even have the hope that I can be able to pay all those areas. In essence, I have terminated your work, but you are still working. I've not written to you. That's number one. You also talked about the aspect of unpaid leave. It is very clear that you're going to work Monday to Friday. You are spending money to come to office and work, but you are not being paid. I would literally, as an employee, decide to even lay off myself because I am spending money to come, like Arnold was saying. I'm spending money to come, but I am not earning from that particular work. You also talked about salary cuts. What then can the employers be able to do in a time where they're not earning as much? They're struggling to even maintain their operational costs and yet also have to make a profit as an employer. Have you gone down to look at the actual situation on ground and be able to provide a remedy as government to the actual things happening?
Madrid, I think I will need time really to come here and explain clearly what the government has done. Because I heard Ramadan talking about that there is no, it is an ideal, meaning that the measures that the government has put in place, the measures of building what we call business environment that start with capital, access to capital. Mildred, we know very well that government has put in Uganda Development Bank over 1,000 billion. And that is for small scale, medium enterprises, and manufacturing to access. We have gone ahead and provided over 250 billion to microfinance and circles for business to access. Government has gone ahead and provided 130 billion for cash for work in labor-intensive works. Government has gone ahead and provided money under use fund, women fund, and what you would call a myoga. What I would like, and what I would like to hear, is that this money that has been provided, either it is not enough, or it has been consumed, and the Uganda Development Bank, as we speak, maybe has no resources. But in terms of supporting enterprises, I think Ugandan government has done incredible job.
Okay.
Because these resources are there. But also, do you know that Mildred, government has gone ahead to put in place tax relief measures?
Yeah, I've had a bit of those.
Loans, in the banks have been restructured.
You've deferred
VAT,
payee.
all that is aimed at ensuring that enterprises can get equity to remain in business. But we need also to know that whereas there are people who think that we have concentrated on the formal,
public health.
or on formal,
And
we have forgotten Juakari. No, actually we are doing more on Juakari, because when you look at, for example, Myoga, 250 billion, this money is in Uganda Microfinance Support Center. We have money under Youth Fund, it is there. We have money under Women Fund. This money is there to support these groups, to ensure that they participate. But also importantly, whereas the economists talk about this, it is also important to recognize the business environment that we are currently experiencing in Uganda. Security, infrastructure. All this, I can tell you, I've gone to African countries where power is a problem. It takes a week without seeing power in the city. I've gone to African countries where there is, you can't walk on the street even at 7 because of insecurity. So government, in order to build a conducive environment for business to grow, but also ensuring that the workers or the persons can access jobs, different interventions have to be implemented. And those are to do with finance, tax, registration. For example, we have the legal framework when it comes to enforcement of labor standards. You are talking about whether we go down. Yes, that's why we have over 200 labor offices across the country. And what do? Can I tell you, Mildred, that for the last 3 months, we have facilitated social dialogue where over 20,000 workers have retained the job. It is there. Just bringing employers and workers together, and they are able to talk and understand, and 20,000 jobs have been saved through the labor offices.
Mr. Simwe, that's a tip of the iceberg. I would say a drop in the ocean, but it's very applaudable. I don't want to just wish it away. I totally agree that that's the right move. But I would want to think that's just a small portion of what exactly is happening. Out of your interventions, are these companies, are these private businesses actually adhering to the laws that are existent with regard to the employee relations?
One, what we need to know is that good number of employers have complied. But they
painfully.
Not painfully, because
I want to think it's painfully compliant.
No. Because here we don't force. It's about a willing parties coming together, and you guide. And government, we are supposed to guide, and we have done that. Another area that we have gone into is the issue of COVID labor inspections. And this is very important. We have relaxed the lockdown measures. We know that the cases have started increasing. What we have done as the ministry, we have intensified what we call labor inspections, because the health and safety of workers and contractors and persons at work is our business. So these labor inspections ensures that workplaces are not centers of transmission of this pandemic.
Okay.
And indeed, that's why you see there are many factories. If you've been following these cases, most of our factories are working, and there are few cases that have emanated from those factories.
Oh, yes.
So
yes.
what we need is to intensify, to
Okay.
ensure that we continue to sensitize that the area we handle this COVID, the
The better for
it.
us all.
Yes.
I agree with you. I will be coming to you, Mr. Simo. Arnold, I want to come back to you. I said many of these employers are actually painfully adhering because they know the law can catch up with them somewhere, somehow. Or like Mr. Simo said, that it's a little bit more expensive for the formal work, a little bit more expensive for you, for example, to just end or terminate someone's contract. But we also did see many of these employers in their corporate social responsibility giving to the COVID task force, but yet are now failing of their contractual obligations. Let's put that into perspective, and also trickling down to the informal sector, because it wasn't only for the former employers who came out to, deliver some items to the task force.
Yeah, so even when Commissioner Alex was saying, some of the things are a bit they're very, for the lack of a word, they're very sexy to say and listen to in compliance standards, but the reality is very different. And one of the things that we see, because we get a lot of, calls of people that reach out to us of so many things happening, and which is really, really very problematic.
Maybe those are not going to the labor offices, Commissioner will say.
The reality is actually not all districts have labor officers.
Okay.
We have engaged, and because we work as a consortium across the country, we have engaged with, I'll tell you, there's no probably district in this country that haven't been in. And the challenge when it comes to labor office, and I didn't really want to go a lot to it, because labor officers are hired by the district, much as there is a control from the Ministry of, which is one of the things that we have always argued, that dual role they're supposed to play is very, very problematic, because a labor officer at a district is hired by the local government, but they report to the ministry on so many things because the Ministry of Gender Labor, but it's a long discussion. On your issue that you raised, it's really, so many times I don't even call it corporate social responsibility. It's just brand enhancement. Companies spend a lot of money to enhance their brands. It doesn't make any sense. We've had this. And for me, it was very problematic when you find we are getting a COVID response speech from the president, and he's spending an hour reading who has given what. For what purpose? Yes, it's accountable for it, but
you could have just displayed them in the
display in the paper and say this one has given. But it's shocking that actually businesses demand to be read by the president. But also more shocking that a business will give 500 million contribution to the COVID fund and lay off 20 employees because they cannot. Meaningful corporate social responsibility starts from within. Any company that is really out there to give back to the community, it starts with your employees. I would rather use to give towards addressing COVID and say, 500 million, I'm going to make sure I retain my staff. I'm not making money, but it makes zero economic sense that you're contributing to the task force and laying off your employees. And even broadly, it's affecting revenue collection. One, for starters, that your employees that were monthly pay as you earn and contributing to NSSF and all these things they were doing, now it's not coming in. So in a way that you're laying off their consumption levels are also going up, but also it has a ripple effect that it affects every other person. So that so-called corporate social responsibility for me, it's brand enhancement. It's what companies do to look good, for everybody to talk about them, what they have done. But the most important thing is what are they not doing that they're accountable to do. Corporate social responsibility is a voluntary principle.
You choose to or not to.
You choose to do it or not to do it. If a company decides I'm not going to give the COVID response, what are you going to do to them? But there is an accountability measure that a company owes to its employees. That if I have a contract with you, or if I have hired you to undertake a certain service, I expect that for that service, I will pay you this. And if there are issues that have arisen due to circumstances like COVID, we work around how do we address that. But you don't lay off staff and still give $1 billion shillings to the response team to help everybody else. Because, and that, like I said, meaningful corporate social responsibility starts from within. I wouldn't expect that my boss will not be able to pay me my monthly salary, but is willing to go and help the neighbor's company that is failing. So it's really, really a huge challenge in that sense because it's looked at, sometimes it's, and for me, one of the things that really bothers me when it comes to how we are dealing with the pandemic, but also the economic response perspective to it, is that we have politicized the response. The technical people and the technical way of dealing with it for broader economic recovery is not being undertaken. It's beyond what we are doing and what we are saying. We have, I would say, the IMF are probably given about $491 million.
Yeah.
World Bank has given more than, for general budget support, around $300 million. To education and health to a tune of like 75. That is all money that probably is. So it's extremely hard when even you talk about strategies. And what I really want is how do these trickle down to that person that either lost a job or that person that was working in the factory that was now non-essential, or that person that works in the tourism industry because tourists are no longer coming. How is that? How are we designing strategies that are helping these small, medium enterprises, but also small businesses at the corner? When, and it's really, really important because all this is what Commissioner Alex was saying is very true. But one of the words he had there, which is really important and which is important to interrogate, is access. It's extremely hard to, I've had conversations with people that have tried to even access money under youth fund. Try, Mildred, you in the media, try to say we have such, I'm a woman, I'm a youth, I want to access the youth fund or the women's fund. When it comes to COVID-19, the UDB, the money that is probably the stimulus within the development bank, accessing it, what do you need to access it? Because on the broad discussion, is a discussion like small and medium enterprises, a lot of it, probably what was covered is people that had returns to about 100 million per year. There are so many people that, how would that market woman going to access this fund? You know, so it's, for me, until we look at all these responses from the accessibility of the people that need them, not it is there. Because if you did a survey and ask how many people even know that there is such a fund. The
information flow.
You know, the information flow, how do I access it? How does that woman that probably runs her lunch stall in a market that was closed, now she's trying to come back, or buys vegetables from Nakasera and goes, how does she access? Because this, it's really good to look at a certain class, and so many times it's politicized, but also it's class, that class bit of, you need to have this and this. But also, and it's one thing I probably hope Connie would be able to speak to, even the women, because we have talked to women that struggle to access that money. Because they need, oh, you need, who's your husband? Where do they sign? They need to sign here. What's the security? What's that? And so many times, we have talked to women and says like, yes, I'm a successful businesswoman, but my husband doesn't actually like me doing business. So if you're telling me to access this, I need to get him to sign off. It will never happen. So it's really important that even looking at these response mechanisms that were put in place, even looking at the funds, but are we, and that's why for me Ramadan's initial conversation was very important, assessing the levels and the structure, but also how effective is what we are putting there going to reach to the people.
That's very true. And I want, Ramadan, before I come to Connie to speak about the women perspective, I want you to broadly look at the economic stimulus that the government is looking at. Many people have said it's more of entitled or aimed at survival of businesses, not really the socio-economic well-being of each and everyone. Try to draw for us a picture of the economic stimulus of government and what really it would be able to do.
The minister announced a stimulus of 5.5 trillion shillings.
Yes.
If you add the total, whatever the commission has told you is within that pronouncement, and it is true. UDB is going to have 1,045 billion shillings. They are going to put over 350 billion shillings in what they are calling a MIOGA fund to be accessed by about 17 clusters of enterprises.
Okay.
But these are new enterprises, and they are going to access this money through groups, what they call village savings and group associations. And I'm using there, it's a future tense. They are going to. This money has not yet been availed. There has been a delay in availing this kind of relief funds. Okay, some have been deployed, like some money of MIOGA has been released beginning this quarter. And that's why you see he's saying if you carried out a survey, definitely it's going to be a medium-term kind of approach. It's not going to be in 1 month that everybody will access. But there are still some funding gaps. Then there are also money which is going to be put in what they have termed SME fund, a small, medium enterprise fund. This is going to be targeting about 250 billion, targeting those SMEs that have capacity to employ other people. If you are not an employer, you don't qualify for that. So you shouldn't come and say, me, I was left out because I'm a sole proprietor. The sole proprietor and also running an own business, one person, there is a window through the circles. They have recapitalized Microfinance Support Center at a tune of about 94 billion to provide liquidity to SACCOs and VSLOAs. Now others which are not part of MIOGA, they are quite special. They are a special fund for new enterprises which are going to be created under those 17 defined areas, and they are mainly for youth and women in their groups. So these women and youth fund, they have been collapsed into that, the MIOGA fund. And then you will have now other funds coming to support. So as far as funding is concerned, to me, I think government has really responded well in terms of targeting and structuring and designing those funds. My only challenge I have is when are they providing the money such that people can access it in a timely manner before their businesses have collapsed. Because restarting a business is more expensive than supporting an ongoing venture. So that's why I started with maybe government itself needs help to find money to put in these funds. Because itself, as I've told you, government is an institution of two hands. One who takes away in order for the other one to give. This one which is taking away, it doesn't have a lot of now options in taking, because tax has been affected. Tax revenue window has been affected by the COVID itself. And yet government does not also have a lot of windows in borrowing now. Because there are two sources of borrowing. You either borrow domestically or external. Domestically, we wouldn't encourage government to borrow by issuing more papers to banks, because they will now undo all of the efforts they are trying to do in the other areas of UDB and MIOGA and so on. Private sector will find it difficult to access money from banks. Banks will raise the interest rates. They can't also borrow from the central bank. The central bank, the conventional monetary policy, it cannot work anymore now. What actually would work is fiscal policy. But if you are going to use an conventional, that is quantitative easing, that means printing money. We don't want to go that route again. We know what it caused to Uganda the last time we did it, when we printed money in the early 90s, the kind of inflation we faced in the country. And now inflation is already picking up. Why? Because supply has been affected, the supply side. People are not demanding, but also the supply is not forthcoming. Because of these lockdowns and the borders being under siege, people cannot bring in the goods to meet the low demand. So inflation has begun to pick up, and therefore we need to be very careful how much money we push into the economy through printing. Now, the only window available, therefore, is external borrowing. But external borrowing, we had overdone it to build infrastructure. Yes. Unless we get debt relief now in some areas, or we have access to concessional borrowing from World Bank, from IMF, more to what he has already mentioned, we don't see a lot of window for external borrowing to get this money. So it's a catch-22, which I started with, that we need to discuss realities now. How do you support people who have, like a border rider, who has been under lockdown for 3 months, and by the time he comes out of that lockdown, his border is already taken by whoever lent him money. Because government has not worked out a mechanism of ensuring that these debts are cancelled, for example, or this border guy gets a debt relief. What they are getting now is debt deferment. You will not pay now, you will pay in 3 months. Now the 3 months are over. The same with the rent. These people downtown Kampala who are doing business, landlords want them to pay now money for space which they were locked up for 3 months. For them, they are saying, we are not listening to that. We want our money now.
Because we also have to pay a loan.
Because we also have to pay the bank.
Yes.
So this is where a conversation needs actually to be practical. How does government intervene to ensure that they use, for example, the central bank, if at all, the challenge is the bank, to share risk, to share the risk with the banks, such that the banks agree to give debt relief to small businesses. As large businesses access funds from UDB, let small businesses get debt relief now. Let these people who built the shopping malls get debt relief, such that they can also extend that relief to their tenants. And you have now the economy restarted. But with all of these other things we are discussing, how funds are going to be put in UDB and so on, they are not going to help that particular person who is now being pushed out of his workplace, unless you actually first resolve that before you come to the other bigger picture.
Okay, and I want to come to you, Connie, on the stimulus package. Clearly, Mr. Ramadan Gobi has let us in on the targeting, which is very great, but the issue now would be, when is the money coming? But also, of all the other pre-existing funds, maybe pre-COVID, so to say, the Women's Fund, it was still existent before the COVID. The Youth Fund, it was existent before COVID. But accessibility, what has been the experience of women, particularly in regard to this?
Thank you, Mildred. I must say that you will cooked, we're in the kitchen. We lobbied for this fund highly. So many years, we put in so much energy and pushed the Ministry of Gender, the government, that we needed a fund for women and young girls. And when it was passed, we clapped our hands. The dilemma came at implementation. We were never consulted on how it can reach the woman that needs it, the SMEs, the businesswoman. Of course, there was a criteria, which we know. We have engaged them several times in our forums to come and talk to the women how we can access this fund. That's where we went wrong. And definitely, the women who are actually doing business are not receiving this money. And those who are receiving the money, it wasn't a survey, but I have been evaluating and also engaging some of the women that have benefited from the Women Fund. You see a very significant impact in terms of what they gained in the money that they've got. First of all, you must be a group of women. We all have different characters and expectations with that money, and we have an obligation of returning this money. So they have to be parameters put clearly before this money is, of course, I know they do it, but the perception they know this is government money is not that.
Time for us to eat as well.
Now, we have the men on our side who are putting pressure. I know the money has come. Can we go and pay dowry? Can we go and introduce? Can we go and, I need this money, I have an agency. They will marry a second woman or something like that. So the utilization of this fund, again, creating the impact that it was designed to achieve at the end of the day. As you will, we feel that we're left out. We already organized. We have over 1.5 million women being trained. We're building the capacity over time, 30 years back. And when it came to the criteria of selection, the majority of the Kampala group actually are out. And these are people who are actually earning and feeding the family. They are going to become a problem with this COVID now. They will eventually become a problem to our nation.
Okay.
So that's what I can say about the fund. When you look at the youth fund, it's the same. How many people, I know the figures are there. If you ask now the commissioner here, he will provide the statistics very clearly. But we want to see that meaningful impact that it has created over time. Okay. It's a very good strategy. And obviously, as SMEs and many of the entrepreneurs, they would want to be supported to get to the next level. But as you will not stop, because we believe in advocacy, we believe in empowerment, we'll continue preparing our women to access it.
Connie, Arnold also talked about the expectations for you to be able to get this money. What do you need to have? What do you need to go through? And he highlighted just one, which is very key, but I know there is even more than that. I am getting this money as a woman entrepreneur. I am trying to make ends meet for the family, and you are asking me, and my husband is objected to it, but you are asking me to sign, have my husband get to append his signature for me to be able to access this. What do you look at as some of the, preconditions for one to be able to access some of these monies? Are these conditions the best fit for accessing the money? Does there need to be a bit of change?
Obviously, there are conditions which are not very clear and not very gender responsive. I want to use that word, gender responsive. If you're asking me to bring my husband to access the fund, sometimes you don't know what goes into the house.
We're probably even divorced by the time.
Probably we're even divorced, or we actually have no agreement. Many women are actually in a marriage which are not very clearly structured, but they are in and they're happy. Some of them are very happy actually and very successful. So, but that's one part. The most important thing is that we want the women, even before they go in, do they have an idea? Do they have a business plan? Do they know what they want to do with this fund? But when they say there is a fund, we will go and line up and get this money. Whether we have obliged, we know what to do at the end of the day. And that's where the key challenge is, creating awareness. When you listen to Commission and you listen to everybody, it's nice. But you need to prepare the women. You need to prepare the business owners. You need to create the awareness. I like the issues of labor and what people need to do. But do we know? Are the women aware? And you see, the biggest gap we have with the women entrepreneurs is access to information. Whereas men get the information on their radios and they're busy in clubbing and social events, we are behind though. You're rushing after making your small chapatis to go and do the other work. The unpaid work I talked about earlier, I'm rushing to do that. So I would not get information that these stimuli are there. These opportunities are there for us. And that is what, of course, we provide the information, as you will, to the women. That are our members. But there are many women who are left out in the whole. Earlier on, you actually stopped me, but I wanted to emphasize the aspect of the vulnerability of women on the supply chain. Okay. You see, as we go out to work, if, for instance, you have a factory for soft drink, you're getting the ingredients from the women, smallholder farmers, and along the way, all these are getting laid off because the person has been purchasing is not doing it anymore. They are informal in nature, but they have been depending on someone who has a factory to produce, say, hibiscus, and therefore you have to grow this hibiscus assured of a market. Yeah. They have stopped doing that. So they don't know actually what to do now. Some of these strategies that the government has put in place, they need to be gender responsive because the women, there are certain soft things they can easily do. to be able to increase their income and resources within the household level.
Okay.
And I know part of the strategy this year, government national strategy is ensuring that the well-being at the family level, at the household level. We can't achieve that. Precisely, we cannot, without being able to be conscious. So that whole value chain has been killed, and the women are not participating effectively in public procurement, and will continue to be a big burden to the government. And we are the majority are actually being laid off.
Yeah, sure.
We have been assessing ourselves as the entrepreneurs. Now that we're in the lockdown, do we need 100 workers, for instance? First of all, you realize that when you're actually there at your cottage, you see who is working, who is not working. You will look at effectiveness. You look at, are they actually ready to productivity, to increase your productivity? And we realize that the majority were actually wasting time. So whereas the commission is saying we must dialogue, but this girl can't even run, this young boy can't even run to pick up the
woman
work.
is probably pregnant, and
Yeah,
she cannot
all
as
this
much.
is happening. But when you're pregnant, you still have a right to stay on the job.
Yes.
But the sensitization is inadequate.
Okay.
So we are going to go in the bad side of the law if we are not aware.
But I'll be coming back to Mr. Asimo, whether they're hoping to get us in the bad side, the other side of the law, and be able to listen. But Arnold, truthfully speaking, what are the responsibilities and you know, the key obligations of the employers towards their employees, or the other way around, in this COVID-19 pandemic, where things are hard? Both can be able to see it. I will, for example, give the media. It was essential work, yes, but it was, I think, 10 times more expensive for you to be able to produce a story than it was before COVID-19. So here you are, even you as an essential worker, you're still working, but your boss is probably taking 10 times more expenses. And when it comes to some of the emoluments or some of your obligations, you may not be able to pay. What are some of these key obligations and responsibilities, but also looking at the fact that we're in hard times?
Okay, thanks again. So broadly, the discussion, even much as we kind of anchor it in the whole business and human rights framework, and labor rights and employment relations fall into that. But people don't forget that the core obligation of protecting human rights rests on the state, the government, and the agencies they are put in place to ensure that the Ugandans or citizens or people that are in the country are not abused or violated. But businesses have what we call a responsibility to respect. So that responsibility to respect rights, human rights, or every other right that accrues to an individual, is something that businesses often don't think about. The challenge that we tend to have is that businesses are profit-driven. Rights tend to be expensive, so they are going to think about them in such a way. So they don't normally think about them. And that's why, for me, it's really important that we cannot separate the role of the state to protect human rights and the responsibility of the business actors to respect. But that responsibility to respect is enforced by the state. Because the state, and this is beyond even the employment policy and legal framework, it's anchored within the Constitution, that the government has has an obligation to ensure that non-state actors respect human rights. And that's where business fall in. With this is everything they need to do. If I enter a contract to provide a service to you, you have a responsibility to make sure that, one, I have the tools to provide this service. But also, two, I am paid for that service. And we did issue out, during this COVID, release statements to that effect, that even this was a pandemic, government took measures to, one, to restrict the transmission, to safeguard the population, to limit the exposure of people to, which is very good. We commend the government for doing that. In those directives and measures, unfortunately, some businesses were locked out. But there were a number of recommendations or advice that could be taken. One says, those that can work from home, please work from home. And there were a number of businesses that took that. I would say, for one, I work in civil society, but the nature of work I do, worked from home throughout the pandemic. But your employer has to give you the tools to work from home. Much as I'm working from home doesn't mean I'm going to use my own internet to do office work. Doesn't mean I have to incur more costs to do work. So businesses still have the responsibility to, or any kind of companies or corporates have the responsibility to provide you the tools to still do your work. In the workspaces and business, what they need to do, and good enough, Alex did mention it, the occupational safety angle. Is this company putting in place everything that I need to protect myself at work? And it's unfortunate to say that that is one of the areas that suffers a lot in this country. If you went to some of the production houses, manufacturing and production, you would be amazed at the hazardous nature of work that is undertaken. We've dealt with flower farms, and this is, so for me, that's why I actually say it's really, really a bit too, it's nice to say, but the reality. I have visited flower farms. We have had cases of women that have been poisoned because they don't have any protective gear, and nothing actually happens. You find because of the nature of what they do, the casualization of labor they have, they can't even get a redress to that problem. And a few negotiations here and there, they say, you know what? This is the only job I can do. I will go back and work. So the occupational health and safety angle is really, really important. And people don't get, because when it comes to women in flower farms and the nature of chemicals they use, but also the reproductive health issues that they get. I know the Minister of Gender is now kind of in the phase of designing a breastfeeding policy, because there was, and this also was also triggered within the flower farms with women workers, the fumes that they have to use for, because flowers are very delicate, pesticides and what, but also having conditions that their children get through breastfeeding, because some of these pesticides are all over them. And so it's, for me, it's a huge area that needs to be critically, looked into. Issues around occupational health and safety. It's absurd that we have actually tried to visit companies with local government officials, and companies have stopped them to enter. And so you'll have to call somebody. It's like, and it's absurd, because when we see, a lot of times is that you have certain business actors that are bigger than the state or the local government. We have attempted a couple of times, and I say this, and I've had conversations even with the minister and different people, to engage with the business, with the local government. And the local government is denied. Or an officer said, no, you have to call somebody in this sector. Or you have a member of parliament coming in. We have had this discussion, even with the Competence Commission, where the chairperson was being told to call a member of parliament before she could do her job. And for me, it's really absurd, because that kind of, what we call normally corporate capture, because the finances, the economic powers determine. And the problem with it is that continuous lack of standard setting and regulation affects what the common person then gets.
Yes.
And in these instances, with the local government official said, I'm a public servant, I serve at the pleasure of. So if the person I serve at the pleasure of has said, call me if anybody, what do I do? And it's really, really absurd. And so many times, even this connects to the conversation that Commissioner Alex had talked about. It's an opportunity to learn from a number of mistakes that have been made, but also an opportunity to improve our sectors. You talked about substitution of imports, trying to look at, many companies have been set up, or many companies can do or provide products that we need, that we initially used to import in.
Yeah.
But what, and this is for me, it's where the problem comes in. What mechanisms are we putting in place to, one, to protect the consumer, but two, to ensure that that product they are producing is fit for the purpose?
Okay.
Because it's a huge, huge problem. The regulatory and standard setting agencies, as long as they don't do their job, you'll still now deal with an issue where you've had people producing sanitizers that are burning people's hands. Because everybody says, oh, we can produce this. Yes, we can produce. But are we putting the measures and the frameworks in place to ensure that everything that we are producing is tested, is fit for the purpose, but also we have that broader consumer protection angle, so that at the end of it all, people are still not maximizing profits because there is a high demand for masks. And so many times I look at, even when you talk about, because it's public health, you look at masks people have, like, this mask is actually causing more harm to you
Than
than
good.
protecting you
That's
from.
very true.
So it's a huge problem. But
Yeah.
so everybody is going around it's like, you need to wear a mask, but what are you wearing? And where is it being produced? And can it actually keep you safe from that virus or some other, hazard that you're trying to protect yourself from? And I think that's where we need to be looking at as a country.
All right, Arnold, thank you very much. Well, I can't believe our time is really getting fast spent. But I want to come to you, Commissioner Simwe. What measures is the ministry putting in place to ensure that it strengthens redress mechanisms in cases where there are labor rights abuses? Because they're existent, at least out of our discussion, that is very clear.
Thank you. But I want to thank Ramadan because he acknowledged that actually government has very robust interventions when it comes to access to finance.
Yes.
But also my sister from Iwiri, just to tell the viewers that when you are accessing money for youth, women, emyoga, it is not compulsory that you must have a husband for you to access. No, the women fund is for women and girls. The youth are youth, both boys and what? And girls. And these funds are there. They emyoga. Whether you're a border rider who is a girl, you can form, with other girls, form a group and access this money. Now, when it comes to my brother is talking about being obstructed. First of all, obstruction of labor officer is an offense under the law, under both the Employment Act and Occupational Safety and Health Act.
Do those who obstruct know that it is against the laws? Because we've seen it, we've even seen members of parliament who have been obstructed from, the latest was the Lua Hospital. They closed out and you will not access. It's even captured on media.
Maybe we need to find a way, the legal framework. But from the labor inspections, the labor officers can access at any point in time, day or night, any workplace in the country, as long as there is a reason to believe that there is work being undertaken, and the work that is being undertaken is likely to cause imminent danger, or maybe there are potential hazards that may affect the health and safety of workers. And that's why we continue to sensitize. And I would like to thank my sister who talks about sensitization. I think it is important that we continue to sensitize the labor laws of this country and the role of labor office. And we are doing that. Now, in terms of what we have done, is that we have put in place, or we have issued out national guidelines on the management of employment relations during COVID. And these guidelines are being respected by most of the employers, much as some are still having compliance issues. Number two, we have issued out what we would call standard operating procedures at the workplace. And we have, our permanent secretary has requested the COWs, the town clerks, and the executive director, KCCA, to ensure that these standard operating procedures, COVID standard operating procedures at workplaces, to ensure that they are implemented. And the labor inspections are continuing every day across the country. Three, we have completed what we would call an implementation plan for what you call work-based learning.
Okay.
And this is what we call apprenticeship scheme. You know, Mildred, we know very well that some workers in specific sectors of the economy, like tourism, have been affected because of the limited business. So it means that for them to join construction or commercial agriculture, they must have skills. So this apprenticeship scheme is coming for that. And the implementation plan is ready, and we are starting this quarter.
Okay.
Now, two important laws that are coming, regulations. And we have,
as you wind
and
up
this
on that.
is breastfeeding and child care facilities at workplace regulation.
Okay.
In a few months, we are going to have a regulation where we'll be coming to a place like this one and ask whether it has space for breastfeeding and child care. Because we want our mothers and sisters that once they are working, their productivity, first of all, they are not denied to participate in work, but also it is a one of enhancing productivity. And also looking at the future of our country. Our future of our country is with the children. So we have to ensure that the children get a real adequate time for breastfeeding. And then another regulation which is very critical that we are coming up with, and in 3 months we'll have it, is the domestic workers regulation. We know very well that there are many domestic workers that are working under horrible conditions. Government has recognized that, and we are going to put a regulation to ensure that your working conditions are regulated and are improved. Now,
are we also looking at the unpaid work that Connie was talking about much earlier on? Because there is a lot of work that goes on in the homes with the stay-home mothers.
Yes, and that's why we are, in terms of unpaid care work, the mothers, the stimulus package, the government interventions that we are putting in place, the sensitization, the awareness that we are putting in place, we are encouraging mothers and girls to participate in the labor market. And that's the focus of government, to ensure that every able-bodied Ugandan is able to participate in what? In the labor market and contribute. And that's why.
But Commissioner, this is also labor that's provided.
Yes.
And the reason I'm asking it is because the woman decides, or they've decided as partners, that stay home, look after the children, make sure that the home is steady, I can be able to go and work. But they're still providing labor while staying at home.
Yes. First of all, we are coming up with guidance, apart from what we call the maternity protection provisions provided under the Employment Act. We have not been having regulations for that. Because once you go for your maternity leave, 60, or working days, means that at that particular time, you are able to look after your child, and you are able also to discuss with your husband in regard, because according to the law, we have 8 working hours. Then after 8, you get what we call overtime. You are paid overtime. So what you need to look at is that, and this is what also you need Ugandans to know, we have 24 hours. So in these 24 hours, the WHO recommends that at least we need to rest for 8 hours. Meaning that you are remaining with 16 hours.
To work.
To work. So in 16 hours, whether you're a wife, whether you're a husband, you need to rationalize and ensure that you maximize your participation at work.
Okay. Well, our time is fast spent. I will cut you short right there. And thank you very much, Commissioner Sime. I want to come to you, Mr. Ramadan Gobi, as we get to wind up this. What's the way forward? But also, we've talked about loan restructuring. I and you have had a discussion on the nitty-gritties of loan restructuring. It's not just saying, I've waived off, you will pay in the next season. What do we need to do? Commissioner Sime also talked about the fact that, well, it's not all been bad in this season. There are companies or industries that have stemmed up. But the question is, that has also been asked by Kasita, will, for example, the sanitizers and those producing masks still be desirable even after COVID, or after we get a vaccine for COVID? What happens to them?
Thank you. Before I come to that, it's been good you came to this panel, because you realize that perhaps COVID actually came to refocus us.
Yeah.
To refocus the world, and also to bring sanity back. Because listening to my good friend, the commissioner, elaborating what they are going to do or what they are having in the pipeline, you wonder what they have been doing before COVID. Because these are the very issues you would find that are needed for the society to work. All the regulations is mentioning, which they are bringing, they are the regulations I thought they were doing before. But I knew that anyway, they were not regulating. Now COVID has taught us that we need to regulate. Yeah. You can't depend on the goodness of man to manage a society. Those people will self-regulate. Now coming to your point, first on the loan restructuring, I think government did announce that all banks are going to defer loans by at least 3 months. Bank of Uganda announced. And we clapped. Yeah. But I was among those, actually I think I was on this station, who said that this is not good enough. Deferring liability is as good as actually doubling it. Because by the time you're going to catch up with that liability, you will have more others also to pay for. And remember, this is a debt which people were incurring at a time they were not earning. And the government just deferred it, just asked banks to defer it. Me, I thought actually government should have been more proactive in encouraging banks to share the risk with the people who had borrowed money. Because it doesn't require genius, really, to see that if I'm not working for 3 months consecutively, how do you expect me to raise the money, even if I reopen, to pay for that debt when I didn't earn? Are you going to also postpone the one which I'm going to be incurring from that point in time when I start paying the arrears? So I think really it's not yet too late for government to reconsider 2 things. The commercial banker loans portfolio can be warehoused. This is what countries have done. They have warehoused all of these commercial banker loans and start a renegotiation process with the banks to see how they can share risk between the borrower, the government, and the bank, so that they can get that debt off the books of the borrower.
Okay.
Then 2, the utilities. I've heard that now people are being asked to pay for electricity.
And water bills.
And water bills in buildings which were locked. Who was using this electricity? Okay, you can say there were security lights and so on. But does really a landlord have to charge that from the tenants when there is a government? You need to stop that. Then rent. The rent falls in the same category as the loans. Also, we need to find ways of helping the owners, because I don't want to say, let the landlords forget about this money. They also have obligations. They are supposed to pay bank loans, which are long-term. And the banks just also deferred those bank loans for certain. So the starting point is restructuring of those loans, and I've told you, you can warehouse them and negotiate on how to really share the risks between the 3 entities, and you get a solution.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Ramadan Gobi, and I hope that the government out there is listening. I have 2 more minutes to spare. I'll give one to each of you. Connie, I'll start off with you. How do we have an inclusive response that does not leave behind the SMEs as well as the women entrepreneurs?
First of all, we expect all players to be gender sensitive and have gender responsive strategies within their framework. To be able to know that whatever they're doing, there's an extraordinary responsibility that a woman does at work or at home. And therefore, to the commissioner, we expect to redistribute the child care, for instance, the labor that happens at home. Both our husbands, they should be, there should be a way of redistributing the labor.
Yes.
So that we also get time to go and make money.
Yes.
And we are helpful to each other. If that can't happen, then it's going to be one-sided, again, like I said earlier. As you will, as the women entrepreneurs, we are now emphasizing on export. We are preparing the women to engage in activities that can lead us into export. One of the things we are going to do with them is to see that they are in textile. These are things they can do at home. We have learned during COVID that you can do perfectly very well at home. You don't have to go to NASA Road or wherever and do your work. And I think that is a very good thing that we have learned from them. So we're going to see that we prepare women to engage in exports, textiles, agri-foods, agribusiness products that they can do at home, but also going to see that they can engage into things like accessories. We already have an engagement with a development partner to see that we prepare the women, because we cannot remain the way we've been doing things during the lockdown and how we used to do it before COVID pandemic. But one of the better things that we want to ask our commission to do, I said earlier that we need to be informed, we need to be sensitized, we need to be aware of all these things that are coming. In fact, I've picked some of my actions. On Monday, I'm going to be on his door with the women. There's so many women. We want the things, we want to get this money that he's been talking about, and very fast. But there is a critical need to see that the women's voices are amplified. We are now going into elections. The leaders must think about what can the women do to increase their resources back, to reclaim their businesses. I know the women, when you're given salt and soap, you go quickly to vote, but we must know that leadership is very critical for the women to regain their, or recover their businesses.
That is very key. I know time is really fast spent, but we would have loved to continue with this discussion. Arnold, the last minute belongs to you. What's the way forward? And also, in case one needs to seek legal redress, what are the available avenues?
Thank you very much again. And it's really been a very informative discussion, but I will say this, and some of it stems from what Connie was saying and the other panelists. We need to understand that the private is political. A lot of decisions that are taken from political spaces affect the private. And this continuous devaluation of private work at the expense of public, even so many things that probably Connie is saying, and it was not in my plan to have discussions around that. So, oh, you know, you're a woman or you're a man, you're staying home, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. But not forgetting that probably the other person is more focused on doing what they're doing in the public space because some other person is at home doing. So it needs to be costed and that is to the angle of saying contributing to the labor force. Labor has to be known that either it's private or public, and it has to be valued at the same. One of the things that we have been pushing with to the Minister of Gender is that I think as a learning curve, this is a time to really rethink and revisit the discussion around the minimum wage. Because one of the other things that we experienced during this pandemic is that everybody is capable of being vulnerable. It was a point where you could not even give a clear definition of what vulnerability is, because the way we knew it was tested. Everybody was vulnerable. People were losing because so many of the people we know, and it's a hand-to-mouth kind of lifestyle. You earn every week or you earn in a month, and when you don't earn, you are literally, you know. So I think it should be a time now that we rethink broadly issues to do with social and economic protection, employment protection, benefits of threats around it, and it can't be left to the private actor. The state has to play its role to regulate, to set standards, but beyond all, to enforce. A lot of things that you hear, we look at so many things. There are clear regulations on place, there are clear policies there, but nobody is enforcing them. It's really, really sad, because one of the other things, and I still say, the politics around. So when continuously you see we have the regulatory this, we have enforcement this, we have that, and the people that are supposed to do it are totally at the mercy of a police person or a private actor that has been hired by a company that says, oh, my boss told me, don't come in. Whether you are Commissioner Alex, I don't know you. I work for Mr. Ramadan. He pays me on a monthly. He says, nobody should access this office unless I sanction it. So and that's why for me, I'm bringing this, because when they say, you have, as an officer, you have rights to inspect. That is the law. A very good law, you have the rights. But meet the askari there who tells
You
you,
will.
my boss told me.
Yes.
You need to call him or call this person. And this is the things that we continuously see.
Okay.
But in a wrap, and I know time is not really on our hands, I think this is a time to revisit the minimum wage, to understand that we need to pay people a living wage, but also to understand that different sectors have been affected differently, and we have to see how do we strengthen the policy and legal framework that enhances their capacity to survive such a pandemic. Because today it's, COVID-19. Tomorrow it could be something else. But we need to be, but the way things are going on, I feel like we have not learned anything. We are just taking things business as usual and going back. Okay. And that's why I agree with Ramadan, his last point, and how countries have done it. Any economic response plan needs to be able to trickle down to address the real issues that people have faced. Rent, domestic bills. For me, that would have been the minimum a government would have done in a lockdown, to say, can we suspend probably water bills or electricity for a certain period, so that people are not still pressed by this daily consumption, which is out of, because I think that is a social contract we have between us
and the government.
Okay. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Arnold, it's been a pleasure. Connie, thank you so much for your deliberations. Commissioner Simwe, it's always a pleasure to have you back. We'll keep pressing you hard until many of the promises are fulfilled. And to you, Mr. Ramadan Govi, it's always a pleasure and always good for you to break down the hard economics for the lay person to get to understand. This conversation is going to continue in the next 1.5 hours. We are going to take you up to 5 p.m. In our next panel, we're going to be looking at the respect for human rights amidst the business recovery from the effects of COVID-19. Everyone has been affected. So in the quest to recover, in the quest for businesses to get back on their feet, human rights need to be at the center of the discussion. We return with that particular one with our next panel. Well, thank you so much for staying with us. Once again, we are still having the discussion that is surrounding the aspect of human rights in the recovery or post-COVID-19. I know we are not yet post-COVID-19, but at least we are moving towards there with a lot of scientific studies that are going on with vaccines. I also want to remind you that we are socially distanced. Our temperatures have been taken. No one has an alarming temperature. We've only decided not to use our masks to better the audio quality, because then that would be affected and the discussion would not be taken on pretty well. But we followed all the guidelines according to the Ministry of Health that were provided, and we are good to go. And a special thank you, of course, to the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights for ensuring that this discussion does come to pass. In the first panel, there is a lot of discussion that did come through in regard to economic recovery, the responsibilities that the employers, the social rights, the employment rights between the employers and the employees post-COVID or post-recovery, post-lockdown that we've had. In this particular panel, like I did reiterate much earlier on, it will much be focusing on the human rights amidst the business recovery post-COVID-19. That's going to be our main focus. And starting off from my extreme left is none other than Ms. Salima Namsovia, who is the Executive Director of our hosts this afternoon or this evening, and we're very glad from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Thank you so much for ensuring that this #1 discussion goes on, and for you as well appearing. A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mildred, and all our viewers.
Very much true. They are the viewers watching us online and on television. Following her is Mr. Bernard Mujuni, who is a Commissioner Equity and Rights at the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for coming through.
Thank you. Good evening, viewers, and good evening to you.
Good evening to you. And of course, we also do have with me Ms. Ruth Sechindi, who is the Director Monitoring and Inspection of the Uganda Consortium of Human Rights, the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Right there, I beg your pardon. Ruth is the Director Monitoring and Inspection at Uganda Human Rights Commission. Ruth, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Mildred.
And
good evening.
Good evening to you. And much later on, we do expect Honorable Matia Bwanika, Mr. Matia Bwanika Alwanga, who is the chairperson LC5 Wakiso District. We will be expecting him at a later stage. He's not yet here with us, but in just a few minutes, he will be joining us. I want to start off with you, Commissioner Mjuni. We know that during the lockdown, and even during this particular period, because the discussion hasn't ended, there was a lot of discussion on the aspect of social protection. We saw lots of people coming through and saying, well, NSSF should give us a bit of the money. It said the law doesn't allow us that. We've also learned in a number of times that we are not good at saving, so economically we are not grounded. Are we able to take through this period economically and socially as Ugandans, out of your view?
All right, thank you so much, and good evening, viewers, once again. Yeah, one thing that is very clear is that this country is endowed with a lot of resources, both human, social, and capital, and, economic, and there is a lot. The challenge is, even when we face a pandemic like this one, how do we make sure that we all share the response mechanism equitably? If there is food distribution, it should be equitable in nature. But you find some of the challenges which are obvious. For example, in the targeting process for the recipients of these social protection interventions, like food, you might find that we are mistargeting, for example, because probably we need some redressive measures like a social registry where you can easily target the right beneficiary. But I can tell you that the social protection policy in this country is cognizant of the fact that we need such measures, and the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development is working hard to develop a single registry, the super highway, but also a social registry at community level to make sure that even if you have epidemic or even a disaster, you can easily trace the beneficiaries or the people affected. Yes, we can cope up because Uganda is food secure. That's the first thing. And the challenge is in distributing those resources. Yeah, but otherwise, the mechanisms are in place.
When do you expect we can have this social registry? Because, well, yes, we are learning out of COVID-19. We do not know what lies ahead.
Well, first of all, to develop a social registry, there is a lot of benchmarking, a lot of studies, a lot of, consultation that take place and enrichment process. So far, we are developing a single registry first, which is connecting all the social security interventions at a higher level. And then after that, we will be going for the social registry, which will be now people-centered, community-centered, to map out vulnerabilities and see who is unemployed, who is immunized, who has gone to school, who has dropped out, how many children of a particular gender, where the person with disabilities, how can we target them, where the elderly, how can we target them, where the, the minorities, ethnic or indigenous or, those isolated by islands. By the way, this thing is affecting everyone differently.
True.
Yeah, and so the magnitude differs.
And that's why I wanted to come in and say, you talked about vulnerabilities. COVID-19 has easily and outstandingly showed that everyone can be vulnerable.
Yes.
Everyone from,
absolutely.
At whatever social structure.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone can be vulnerable. No one is safe. In the event that we don't have a universal social protection or social security coverage, in other countries, you find everyone is having access to a particular social protection or social security benefit. Maybe call it unemployment. You have seen maybe in the US or even in Nordic countries, when people fall out of jobs, they get unemployment vouchers and they can use them to claim a particular fee, maybe $200 or $100 or whatever, proportional to what they were earning from the government or from insurance companies. But here we don't have it. Probably it's time to think about MobiSave, for example, a social security scheme where everyone is contributing automatically because of what they are, loading and airtime transaction. Whoever has mobile money or mobile phone should be in a position to save universally. Some of these can help. so that tomorrow, if the disaster strikes like it has done, you can fall back on what you have been saving to, other than NSSF. I agree with the comments and the reactions from the public that people should open up NSSF. But of course, NSSF is not a holding business. It's not a bank. It doesn't keep cash. And so it invests that money somewhere else, in the offshore investments, in bonds, in equities and all that. And it cannot have money available. It has to invest it to bring back the return on your savings.
Okay.
And that can be a challenge also. It takes time for you to open it up. And that means you're making NSSF a deposit-taking institution, which is totally different in social security circles. So whereas I sympathize with access to your benefits, it can be done in a manner that is that can help to save again and not destroy what you have already built. Yeah.
All right. Well, Madam Salima, here comes in the aspect of businesses, because we clearly know everyone is affected. The businesses are affected in terms of cash flows, in terms of being able to meet their day-to-day running costs. But just how more responsible can they be along this economic recovery, that human rights are put in perspective? Because whereas you are saying, I am not making enough money, I want to lay off, you have this employer who has probably worked with you for a very long period of time. It is justified you're not making money, but just how more responsible can they be able to balance up the times?
Thank you, Mildred. You know, responsible business conduct entails a number of things. It includes compliance with existing laws, for example, those relating to respect for human rights, individual and group rights. It also entails environmental protection, for example. It also entails the discussion that was here earlier in terms of labor relations. But it also speaks to issues like financial accountability. And with financial accountability, you also include things like paying their fair share of taxes, which is something that is very critical for economic recovery. But as we recover from the pandemic, we run the risk of having what one would technically call a race to the bottom, where our businesses engage in various shortcuts in order to maintain or maximize profit. And this is something that we must discuss and preempt that conversation in order to ensure that businesses are being accountable and paying their fair share of taxes. And I'll give you some of the examples that could happen. One of the things is the issue you talked about, is the issue of redundancies. We know very well that many companies will hide behind COVID-19 to say that they do not have money to maintain their staff.
Yes.
But we know, and from engaging with various employees, we know that many companies were planning these redundancies even prior to COVID-19, just to cut their costs. So COVID-19 is only serving as a cover for many of them. But we must be able to make these companies accountable to ensure that if they are going to lay off staff, it is really for justifiable cause. They are not hiding behind the pandemic to say that they are laying off. And that is just one thing that could happen, and it has been discussed at length earlier. But we also run the risk of businesses under declaring profit.
Very true.
For
and
purposes of paying less taxes than they should be. We know that under various laws and regulations, a lot of tax payment depends on self-declaration of what profit you're making. So under the circumstances, and with COVID-19 coming up, you will see that many companies will be under declaring their profits and seeking to pay less taxes. But this has an impact on how we finance social services, on how we finance health, on how we finance education. So it's also the other area that we must really look at, because finance and URA are currently saying they are not collecting enough money.
Yes.
But we know that not everybody is hard up. There are companies that have remained a going concern, even in the midst of COVID-19, and we should be able to make them accountable. But there's also a practice of illicit financial flows, and this is mostly common with multinational companies, companies that are dealing in offshore dealings. So in a situation where our state has limited capacity to even monitor the illicit financial flows, we run the risk of more money getting out of the country illegally, and therefore having less resources to be able to help the country recover from the pandemic. And that is the other thing that I also want to put on the table. But perhaps lastly, I would want to talk about shortcutting the quality of services that businesses may be offering. And we know that many people will want to maximize profits, and they will start engaging, cutting down on the cost, compromising on quality, hiring unqualified workers, for example. And this is important in sectors like health, like education. You'll see that people are trying to cut costs, but also the goods, as we are promoting, for example, Bubu. We need to also consider the quality of the products we are bringing on the market. So in a bid to promote Bubu, we have to ensure that the companies that are involved in this production are not compromising on the quality, the ingredients, if they're going to produce something, not to produce something that is harmful. But lastly, there is also the issue of environmental protection, which is important because usually we know that environmental degradation, pollution usually impacts on communities. For example, you may find companies now having shortcuts in terms if they are a manufacturer, for example, an industry, and they are doing some measures to ensure that they don't pollute the water, for example, that is being used by societies. You may find that they now start cutting back on that because they want to restore themselves to where they were before COVID-19. And these are dangerous trends that we need to really discuss before people engage in them, but also engage the government to be very alert in doing this. And it doesn't mean that businesses can't continue, but they must continue in a way that is respectful of human rights, that is respectful of labor rights, that is respectful of the environment, and they are contributing their fair share to the economy with regards to payment of their fair share of taxes.
Okay. Well, we will be coming to the aspect of shortcutting because we know that's been quite existent, but where is the part of government in playing to ensure that they remain frugal? I will come to that, Ms. Salima. Ruth, are we on track with ensuring that human rights are protected on this road to recovery that everyone can't wait to accomplish?
Oh, thank you, Mildred. I think when COVID-19 came in many countries were not prepared.
Not at all.
So Uganda is just
actually
like
no country was prepared.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So Uganda is just like any other country that is learning along the way, that is trying to put in place safeguards, safety nets, and measures as we go on. And the question of whether we're on track, we have no basis to determine whether we're on track. But coming from the human rights angle, we know that human rights have to be implemented and enforced in every aspect of our society and in every response mechanism. Now, when we look at the issue of health, we realize that the state as government has invested a lot with regard to health. However, when it comes to issues of socioeconomic aspects, we know that businesses play a big role in economies and in social aspects. And because of COVID-19, we have noted that it has exposed and further increased a lot of vulnerabilities, economic and social, so that the poor have become poorer. And the poor have actually failed to, are struggling to sustain themselves. And we realize that those that have a limited levels of education or those who are just fresh from school, who had jobs, many have been laid off because the companies are struggling. and also they have lost capital, or those that that had small businesses, they are collapsing or on the verge of collapse. So the recovery process is a hard process for many business enterprises, and human rights in many aspects have not been put at the forefront. Yet we have been saying human rights has to be at the center, or it should be people-centered, where human rights have to be recognized and persons have to be put at the center of all interventions. Now, we have noted that businesses are laying off workers because they can't afford. The running costs are very expensive.
Yes.
We note that many businesses have lost capital, and that the government is discussing ways of how to support them into recovery. Now, are we there yet? No, we are not. Because if you look at the levels of the numbers of the victims, the numbers are rising. And because of that, people are more scared. And now we are seeing that goods are being hoarded. People are hiding away goods, storing food, because they anticipate for the worst. And that means the prices are still up there, and it affects the ordinary person. So all these are human rights issues that we have been calling on the state to intervene, so that it's not only about the right to health. Yes, the right to health is very important. The right to life is very important. However, we have to look at the socio-economic issues that, that affect an ordinary person. And these relate to all the other aspects, whether it is food, whether it is shelter, whether it is education. All these have been affected by the pandemic. So Uganda we can't right now boast that we are there yet, but I'm glad that safety nets are being put in place, but we need better. And safeguards, we need appropriate laws and policies to ensure that the recovery process is human rights based and puts people at the center of the interventions.
We will continue with that discussion. Let's look at what it's been like. Maybe we are having this discussion, and someone out there, because we know of businesses that have gained from this particular situation, someone out there may be saying, well, I don't understand what you're talking about because it's totally different on my side. I want to come to you, Mr. Matia Lwangabwanika. We know, away from Kampala, which is the city, we know that there are not even so many people that, they come to Kampala to work and stay outside of Kampala in Wakiso, in Mukono, and the neighboring district. But there is also a lot of business activity going on. Case in point, Wakiso, what has been the situation in this COVID-19 period? With all the guidelines that were put in place, there was curfew, non-essential workers are not working. What's been the situation? You as a leader, what do you see on ground?
Thank you very much. First of all, the pandemic was spontaneous. It was drastic, meaning that none of us can claim that he was well prepared for it.
Yes.
And of course, I may give this topic perspective of civil governance context vis-a-vis the COVID pandemic. Of course, whatever has gone on is history, but it's like we are there to live with the pandemic. There are no clear signs that it is going tomorrow or the other day. So to begin with, I would suggest that the firefighting is now finished. It's upon we in governance to come up with drastic steps, having legitimate, legal and binding regulations, using state apparatus, using all institutions like Parliament, because Parliament has all committees. Here we are talking about the economy and human rights. But we have all those committees in Parliament which can, begin with making thorough study and research with relevant institutions and organs, and they come up with legislations to have an orderly kind of approach to the pandemic. Of course, having said so, if we look at the human rights perspective, depending on the three generations of human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and finally the special interest group consolidated rights. You find that even the timing, if we begin with the civil political rights, the timing of the pandemic especially here in Uganda, collided with a political season, and you may find that there is lack of fairness especially those who belong to the body politic, on how, it's like the freedom to associate, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of choice, freedom of everything, expression and so on.
Basically, the balance between public health and then the civil and political rights.
Yes, what I'm saying, because the topic has been, is economics and human rights during and post-COVID.
Yes.
So I'm giving it a perspective from the 3 generational rights, because we have 3 stages or 3 categories of rights. We have civil political rights.
Yes.
We have that as the first category. The second category is economic, social, and cultural rights. And the last category is about the special interest group rights. So to begin with the first generation, I was looking at that perspective, that the timing, maybe if this pandemic had come during when we had come out of elections, that would be okay.
Yes.
But now we are politicking, and there are so many regulations, either by default or by design. That is another debate. But you find that rights are being infringed from that civil political rights. Then we go to economic, social, cultural rights. My predecessor, the previous speaker, has been echoing on how the economy has, gone to, and the economy is like saturation of blood in the human body. Once you affect one sector of the economy, the whole system collapses.
Affected.
So you can look at more than half a year. For instance, in all government sectors, these ministerial, they send us documents. Well, the whole of the 4th quarter, money was not remitted. We had running contracts. We had committed ourselves with contractors of roads and other, meaning that sooner or later we are liable
to pay fines.
Yes, because once you sign a contract, you have committed yourself.
Yes.
Now the contractor has the right to do the work, and you have the mandate to pay the contractor.
Yes.
But all of a sudden, communication from the center was close. No more, there was no funding in the last quarter of last financial year on every sector, especially, except towards COVID. So that is also going to affect even some local governments by paying penalties because they failed to fulfill their obligations. That is one angle. Then 2, for instance, in Wakiso we have more than 3,000 schools, but only about 600 are schools belonging to government. The rest belong to the private sector, private entrepreneurs. In fact, during the pandemic, we lost more than 5 directors of private schools out of, stress and pressure.
Wow.
Yes, because they had staff, they had loans in the banks, the term had just begun, or teachers, because if we have, for instance, like 10,000 teachers in Wachiso, you'll find that 60,000 are from the private sector. And private sector means you have to pay school fees. There must be activities at the school. The school must be going on to. So you can imagine all that. It is a kind of formal employment, but in the private sector, because those of government are still receiving their emoluments and salaries.
Yes.
But those in the private sector, who are even 3 times those of government, are not receiving that. So that's why you've had even teachers resorting to vending sugar canes and so on and so forth. That's not something small. Then when we look at the social sector, look at these young children. I remember there was a group of Save the Children development partners who approached us, engaging us in governance, saying that we have made research that our children being at home during the COVID is even more dangerous than exposing them to the pandemic when they go to school.
Yes.
They were saying the effects of being at home at that age has more problems than going at the school. And they were saying, please, look at the, how do you call them, the SOPs. Whether this class had 40 students, pupils, you can say, let's have 20 and they study in
Shifts.
alternative shifts and alternative days, and so on and so forth. Put up, stringent measures and so on. Otherwise, they were saying the effects of keeping children away from school is more dangerous.
We've seen reports of many girls getting pregnant, actually.
Yeah, and so on and so forth. So many things are happening, by the way. And it's like, that's why I've said, from the governance perspective, we wouldn't have relaxed if the measures which were taken were drastic and spontaneous. You could excuse anyone. But since that time till today, what has been done tangible in response to the pandemic? Because it's like we have to live with it. It's there and it must happen. That's why I would call upon the parliament, the executive, to come up with bills taking into consideration that this pandemic is here to stay. And then we work according to laws and regulations and rules. Otherwise, we may end up having more problems than what we anticipated.
I totally agree with you. That's very tight. I mean, it's very absurd what is happening. And that's just Wakiso case in point, what's happening elsewhere. Ms. Salima, I want to come to you. Is government really doing enough to ensure that, one, contain the pandemic? That's on one side, and that's a given. It has to be contained because it's protecting life. There is the aspect of economic recovery, yes, because so many people are losing jobs and all that's happening. Then there is also the aspect of human rights. And with this, there's also been the enforcement of the standard operating procedures, enforcement of the guidelines that have been put in place. We've continuously seen on media human rights being violated. Are the three in sync?
Okay, thank you, Mildred. In terms of government doing enough, I would say certainly not. Because, of course, we see that there has been many gaps in the response to COVID-19. But for me, that is another separate discussion that we can have in detail. And for me, what would concern me at this point in time is that as we get back to normal, we need to pay attention to what is happening with regards to the regulation of the business sector that is responsible for contributing towards economic recovery hand in hand. Now, sticking to the regulation of the business sector, it is a government obligation. But we've seen that throughout the pandemic and also getting out of the pandemic, there has been some reluctance on the part of the state in terms of boldly making businesses accountable. We've seen that, when we had the conversation of Bank of Uganda lowering lending rates, and they were pleading with the banks, for example, to lower their own lending rates in order to get more people to do businesses. It's only recently that the bank now threatened to do more, and they are threatening banks that they should also be able to lower. Yes, so in that regard, and also you see the issue to do with rent, like it has been employment, the government has been just negotiating with business actors, and yet people need the protection. The government has a responsibility to protect communities from the adverse impacts that may result from business activities. And one of those areas is to remind the businesses that from our constitution, businesses are also required to respect human rights. And here, we are not only talking businesses like in a shop, but private actors are required to also respect human rights. So we should all be in this together, and government should be able to enforce that constitutional obligation. But also, with regard to other regulation, like I mentioned earlier, government has been reluctant also to tackle the difficult things like illicit financial flows. We need to pay attention. We have many multinational companies operating amidst us, for example, and we need to move faster in terms of getting to speed, building the human resources, building the technology that will help government to be able to track the outflows of the money that is getting out of Uganda, because we need it. at this point in time, because you see, when we got to economic recovery, government was just passing around a basket and saying, you know, who can contribute, calling upon individuals to contribute.
Yes.
But if we fix some of the gaps that we have, for example, from stopping the flow of resources outside of the country, it would be more useful. But also, particularly with regard to service delivery, again, regulation has been slow. Many private entities, the chair here has been talking about education, for example, having the private sector doing a lot within education. And you ask yourself the regulatory role of the government, but also the role of the government to fulfill the rights where, because it is their obligation.
Yes.
Now, in terms of regulating the private sector, if I use the examples of health and education, for example, we see that government has been playing catch-up. They liberalized the economy and let every businessman who had money to come into the sector and provide education and provide health, which has caused a lot of problems. Now, the schools that the chairperson is talking about as closing, these are schools that some of them were not on solid grounds. They should never have gotten licenses in the first place.
True, true.
So if government is not going to be critical in terms of seeing who they are licensing to get into sectors like education and health, this is why we've struggled. This is partly why we can't open the schools, because even when people mooted the idea that, okay, maybe let's try and open up for the candidates, many private actors were saying, no, we cannot, because we can't fully run those schools with only the candidate classes. If we had the bigger majority of schools being public aided schools, it would be a more manageable situation, such that you only have those private actors who are meaningfully supplementing the government service provision. And it is the same thing with the health sector. And again, we are going to see it a lot. With COVID-19, you saw that, okay, many of them were waiting for government, many health facilities, to give them money to respond to COVID-19. But we also saw things like the scandal that happened last year with regard to the insurance sector, where the health sector players were engaged in fraud. You know, they were making demands for services that they did not give to people. And this goes back again to regulation of these sectors that the government is not doing adequately. We always think that the idea of public-private partnerships. But the regulation, again, that we have in place is not effective to get us there. And as we get into COVID recovery, again, people are saying government needs to partner with the private sector. But what we are seeing is that the regulation is behind schedule. You know, the public-private partnerships are moving ahead before the government gets in place its systems. Okay. If you look at health, for example, there is a policy on public-private partnerships. But the institutional mechanisms to be able to operationalize it are not in place. And now we are here rushing and saying, okay, the private sector needs to also come in and provide services for COVID-19.
Yes.
But how are you going to monitor the quality that is coming out of those sectors? Okay. You know, and many of them have been pushing for self-regulation, for example. But in a context like Uganda, where many people are poor and do not have the agency of standing up to the private sector, there has to be heightened government protection to ensure that the services provided, to ensure that the goods that people are getting are actually of good quality. Very and true. This is where I really would call upon Bernard is here. I'm sure he will talk about the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. But it is something that is really critical to give us a framework for seeing how we can maximize the benefits that come from business action, but at the same time respect human rights.
Government's role entirely coming through. Bernard, do you want to respond in regard to that? Yes, please, go ahead.
Much, Mildred. Yeah, one thing very clear is that COVID-19 has brought up new areas of discrimination and inequity. You can see people being excluded from accessing services because they cannot afford internet. People being excluded because they are called non-essential. workers, and that's a new way of categorizing. People
Very
being
true.
excluded because they have recovered from COVID-19. And people being excluded because they are being targeted as vulnerable, as the most poor of the poorest to receive COVID even response measures. And therefore, you are looked at as officially poor. You know?
Yeah,
and
we have to
can't-
give you food because
yes,
you're
yeah,
poor,
they have
really.
to give you food. And therefore, that's your status in society. And that's stigmatization. And these are new areas which have emerged that we want to focus on. But much more importantly, is that it is also an opportunity for us to re-echo the fact that we need to come up with over the board kind of response measures that can create a response that is more inclusive. For example, we are developing a national action plan on business and human rights to make sure that there's corporate social accountability, that there's corporate accountability that in the delivery of service. For example, Salma here talked about education, and the chairman also talked about education institutions. You know that for such a long time, education institutions have been excluded from paying taxes, isn't it?
Yes.
And they got a tax holiday proper. And now they are the ones who now want to be bailed out of the stimulus. So it's a careful balance. You have not been paying taxes. Yes, you've done a social impact by giving jobs.
Giving a service. and
All right?
jobs, yeah.
A service. But now you want a stimulus to come to you. And it's true, by the way. They should be helped out. So it's a careful balance. But you have other people in the creative economy. Creative economy, the artists who have not been financed or funded or anything, but they are suffering. You don't have DJs playing music.
Yeah.
You don't have comedians playing. You don't have people releasing songs in studios. You don't have Bivulu. And so, of course, URA is also not collecting money. And these guys are not about to be on the stage. How are they surviving? What do they have in the stimulus package that we are making? And these are the areas that we need to think about. You need to think about things like social impact bonds. On finance, where you are creating magnitude, a high-level social and positive social impact, where you're putting the stimulus money. But unfortunately, it might end up being in already established entities.
Is that the action plan that is looking at people who have lost their
The
incomes
action
entirely
plan
now?
actually is mapping out value for money when you're investing. When you are holding corporates accountable, it looks at how are they integrating the fundamental human rights into their business processes. So this is where the National Action Plan becomes very important, that there is a responsible sourcing, that your value system, value chain does not involve child labor, that there's no slave labor in the way you, that there's fair wage, even if there's no minimum wage, your payment isn't slave labor, that you're not holding people because of desperation, you're not holding them as slaves to work for you, and that actually you are not, you're recognizing gender equality at world of work, but you also even have vulnerable workers, or even the so-called the working poor, those who cannot afford to work every day. If they worked every day, I mean, given 5,000 average transport stage to stage from Kampala, if a vulnerable worker who earns 200,000 a month comes every day to office, how much would they take at the end of the month? So you look at some of these issues and say, look, let's have a reality check. Our sourcing mechanism should be human rights sensitive. And that's the National Action Plan on business and human rights. But as a ministry, we are also bringing social impact assessment and accountability bill. And this law also introduces social impact bonds. Social impact bonds are avenues. You saw how people were coming up to support government during COVID. But there's no clear regulatory framework where people can give back to government other than the taxes, you know, and grants. Actually, one can hold you accountable for receiving those donations immediately, you know, from the public, because there's no mechanism for you to account. But this law is supposed to map out areas of that nature, that if you want to construct a road that is helping the society, KCCA shouldn't hold you, you know, like shouldn't stop you. And
Very
you know,
true, very true.
you should come and say, okay, this road is, the bridge is going to link these communities, please do it and hand it over to us. And that's a social impact bond. Even health centers, even schools, philanthropists have avenues for funding government programs in that way. And it's regulated other than haphazard. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty interesting because
Yeah.
I've seen so many people have battles
Oh,
on,
yes.
for example, roads.
Exactly.
Merely.
Exactly.
And KCCA says, no, you cannot be able to
even
do that.
social protection interventions.
Very true.
Yeah.
Ruth, in this case, many of the employers or industries and factories because they're not making enough money, because the times are hard, have thought it wise that you either, do salary cuts, whether with negotiation or without, you either lay off people and paid leave and all those. Is this the right way? Is this the right move that businesses ought to be taking in such a critical time?
Because we realize that COVID-19 has led to a lot of human rights abuses and exploitation of workers. We have noted that many companies, for example, if you're earning 500,000 and you're running a machine, so they've come in to say, yes, we are laying off half of the workers, or you can come and renegotiate and get 100,000 or 150,000, which is really exploitation. And some of these companies had continued working, so they are not some of those companies that were really struggling. And so you realize that they're trying to exploit the vulnerable and the poor. So, and others have been laid off on discriminatory grounds. You are a person with disabilities, they have been standing you, or you have been sick, you have a chronic illness and they couldn't sack you at the time. So this has become the time when employers have come out to exploit, to abuse workers, and exploit the system. So by laying off persons in a discriminatory way, whether on age, you're about to retire and you have 2 years, they're like, no, you're the first one to go. You have a disability, you're a sickler, you lose your benefits and all that. So we have said, no, COVID-19 did not take away the Ugandan constitution. It did not take away the laws of Uganda. It did not take away human rights. So we are saying, can all businesses follow human rights standards? Can government monitor what business is doing? Because under the human rights discourse, government is the primary duty bearer. It should be able to protect citizens over exploitation and manipulation of third parties, and that is businesses. So government, through the line ministries, should be able to monitor what businesses are doing. Should be able to say, okay, if employees are losing are being laid off, what can we do? What is the criteria for each company to lay off workers? What criteria has it used? Yeah. What are the benefits of these workers? Have they received their benefits in a timely way? And can we have a bailout? Okay, there's the issue of the stimulus package, but we have said it should be people-centered. And if there is a bailout, who benefits? Is it a nephew or a niece or a brother who should get part of this, the bailout? What is the criteria? Is it struggling, the medium companies, the small-scale companies, or the light-scale companies? We have to look at the criteria of this bailout and the stimulus packages, and it should be people-centered and human rights-centered. Because if we do not do that, businesses sometimes are very powerful, and in many cases, some are very more powerful than the state itself. So we should have a monitoring mechanism. We have to look at how these businesses are implementing the standards or the laws that we have in place, because many of them have since veered off track, and they are busy exploiting Ugandans. They are busy abusing Ugandans.
And that's why we ask, where is government? Is it
Absolutely. And that is where we have been calling for ministries, the line ministries, to come in. And we as a Human Rights Commission, we have continued monitoring. We have been visiting lately companies and some workers reported cases. And one of the cases was, it hasn't gone to the tribunal, we sorted it out. But one of the cases involved workers who were somewhere in a factory and were not being allowed to go home. And after that is the lockdown, they were saying, can we go and see our families? And the way we are checked is rather indecent. They think everyone is a thief. So we went in and talked to the management, and thankfully, they learned to respect the workers. And we cautioned them, we shall continue monitoring what you do. And we also cautioned the workers and told them, you can report anytime. So the fact that they know that there's a place where they can report, that means, they have that protection. But many people out there do not know, and others are exploited and have accepted to be exploited because they have no alternatives. But Ruth, so if you have no job, or you're afraid, you have 5 children, you're a single mother, or even a single father, and if you're a Muslim, it is even worse. You have 3 wives or 4 wives, and you have to cater for 4 families at once. Obliged. And you have this 500,000, I am sure you will stand the abuse, just to make sure that your family stays afloat.
And this is where I wanted to ask, before I go to Mr. Matia Bwanika. Why is it that we need to have a stick behind? I mean, there is a stick hovering over you, a stick of the law, have to be reminded, when we have all these laws, and yet we continue to have such human rights abuses. Where exactly is the problem?
It's about compliance, it's about attitude, because companies know that the laws exist. They have policies that they have veered off, and yet they continue to abuse workers. They continue to go below the standards, even producing substandard goods, because they know at this point, Uganda is not importing goods. So we can as well produce whatever we can. So the reduction in standards and the continued abuse is not about the lack of laws. It's about attitudes and the failure of us or the state to adequately monitor and enforce these laws. Okay. Now, we need a stick as human beings. If there is laxity and you know that there's anyone watching over you as a human being, yes, we're naturally rebellious, we belong to the jungle, surely we'll cut corners just to make sure that we maximize the profits as much as we can at the expense of maybe the populace.
Okay, I'll give you just a minute here.
You know, with the Equal Opportunities Commission undertook a study on discrimination and structural exclusion, and I realized that 3% of GDP is lost because of discrimination and exclusion. 3% of GDP. You can imagine if that turned into a positive. But much more importantly, wherever you see exclusion and discrimination, there is money behind being made. Someone excludes because they want to benefit from it and make a dividend out of it, a benefit, a profit. So human rights mean a lot of business, make a lot of business sense. So the more you cut off the human rights, the more probably you can increase your profitability. The more you don't pay taxes, the more you make gain out of it.
So
the
it's
more
a
you
bargain.
undermine labor and pay poorly, the more you are making return on investment in terms of illicit benefits. The more you don't comply with all the other standards, the more you are benefiting from it as an individual, as a corporate. So every abuse has business aspect of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
A discussion
please
that
go
Ruth
ahead.
started earlier. Access to remedy is a key component of making businesses accountable. And we see that we've struggled a lot with access to justice in terms of people getting businesses or companies pay for the wrongs that they are doing from a human rights perspective. But you see that we do, for example, if you look at the formal court or quasi-tribunal cases, we have the formal courts where people can go and handle their cases, but we also have the quasi-judicial tribunals that are housed by institutions like the Uganda Human Rights Commission. But there are challenges in terms of utilizing these. Now, the quasi-judicial tribunals are looked at as a simpler way of people accessing remedy where they will engage in things like mediation, but also hear cases and be able to give people justice instead of going to the courts of law. But you find ourselves, for example, currently the commission, the Human Rights Commission is not fully constituted. They do not have a chairperson. They still have some vacant places in terms of members. And it becomes difficult for them, even if they receive these complaints, it becomes difficult for them to take them through the normal processes if they are not fully constituted. But also when you look at the formal courts of law, there are many challenges. There could be challenges of distance. As ISER, we did research around access to justice for economic and social violations. But there are challenges ranging from, for example, the distance, the cost of getting through the courts of law, but simply also the prioritization of these cases as being important. So you find situations where now it is election season. You find that all kinds of cases to do with elections will go through the courts of law and will be heard in record time.
Yes.
And yet we benefit very little from these ongoing elections as Ugandans. But you find that you file cases regarding social issues, regarding health, regarding education. You file them and they're in the courts of law for 5 years. As ISER, for example, we have cases that are before the Constitutional Court and they've never even had a hearing. You know, but if you're going to deal with companies, they are operating like every day. There are issues of evictions of people from their land by big multinational entities. But you'll find that the case people file, and it will take ages for them to even simply get before the judges, to even start the conversation. You know, these are things that we need to look into in terms of prioritization, of equal prioritization. We cannot simply focus on cases being brought by politicians, because at the end of the day, actually, there is very little that we as Ugandans are benefiting from many of these players.
Well, that's very true. Mr. Matia Wanika, you have been very vocal when it comes to fighting against abuses of human rights amongst businesses. That's very applaudable. But are you winning the battle? And besides, even if you were to win, you're just a single person. You may not go a very, very long way, although your impact will be felt in a way. This is where I also get to ask, where is the Wakiso District Human Rights, committee, and is it working? What's the progress of the work that's going on?
First of all, I think that was a prerequisite from the Uganda Human Rights Commission, that every district must come up with such an initiative, a committee, and but we have 135 districts, and it's only Wakiso which has established that committee, fully functioning. Of course, with no funding. And I'm sure it's the reason why other districts have failed to come up with one. Okay. But of course, you know, human rights advocacy is a kind of a passion. And it's very critical to find that even we in governance, leaders, for instance, don't appreciate facts of human rights. So that's where the problem begins. It emanates from there, that we in leadership, we don't appreciate human rights as a basic component of good governance. You see, not until you're a victim of rights that you realize.
It's when you stand up.
Yes. Okay. So that is one. Now, two, you've said, well, if you fight it alone, and you see, I would suggest, if you are frustrated by not being joined by other people or institutions, you don't need to shy away, because, for instance, I've been instrumental in fighting for the environment. But the effects of environmental degradation affect everyone. Everyone. Yes. Recently, you see those big guns when all their houses were already in waters. So, if you say that, yes, I'm shouting, but I mean, nothing's coming up. No, nature is now on them. So, what am I saying? Of course, it is, I think it is a responsibility of every individual, from leadership to all, even those who are being led, to know that holistically we need to fight for what is right in every aspect of life. You have been talking about the economy. Sometimes, from a layman's perspective, I really wonder, maybe we over-capitalize. I mean, is it a question of over-liberalization? Look at a scenario where someone has built an arcade in town. He's saying you have to pay me from February when the lockdown came.
And you've not been working.
And you know, he is even aware that even now the padlocks are there. He's aware that every stock of yours is there and no one was coming in to buy. And he's saying, come rain, come sunshine, you have to pay me.
You clear before you enter.
You see? That is one. And now the tenant is saying, but brother, I've not been working. The landlord is saying, no, I've got a loan from government. And you will wonder, how can we leave the country to run? I mean, from, you know, whatever you wish to do, whatever you wish to say. I think there is that laxity. Okay. It's very dangerous that we in the government resorted in collecting taxes and we failed on the side of regulating.
Oh, yes.
Because, for instance, the minimum wage bill, I think it was passed by Parliament. Till today, we don't have the minimum wage. You find foreign investors coming up, taking up jobs which would be done by locals. All these are issues which would be, I mean, I think there must be something fundamentally wrong in this liberalization and capitalism.
Okay.
That's why you find that even those big people with big companies who are abusing the employees, the employees, are doing it with impunity on the basis that they are paying their taxes to the government.
Yes.
They are even helping the government to kind of minimize on unemployment. I was arguing with a certain
self-entitlement.
Yes, you see, and we have so many government agencies because we have the Ministry of Trade, we have these investment authorities, we have even the civil society organization, the Uganda Manufacturers Association, we have the National Chamber of Commerce, we have the Casitas, and so on and so forth. How can all those institutions fail to come up, to sit down with the powers that be, and they come up with something logical? In fact, COVID has opened our eyes that there is a total institutional failure in terms of economy and maybe other issues of rights and everywhere. So we need to have a paradigm shift.
I totally agree. Mr. Bwanika, just even before you respond, raises a very critical issue. And this is where I get to ask, do we have adequate legal and policy framework in place to ensure that these issues of business and human rights are actually dealt with?
You see, with all due respect, I can say there's never enough legal and regulatory frameworks because everything brings its own challenges. COVID, for instance, has brought its own dimension of the way we look at the world, the new normal, the working. For example, the Employment Act is no longer regulating the working whatever, because you can work from home 8 hours and no longer the 8 hours as per the Employment Act and the regulation there under or there. So the virtual office has become a reality, and the Employment Act is still thinking you have to come to your office and work, and therefore the 8 hours of work are 8 hours of work. So things have totally changed the way we work and live our lifestyles. But that notwithstanding, there is need for a competition regulatory authority. In the whole of East Africa, competition in this country is the one which is lacking, the authority. We don't have the authority in this country. Some of our sister countries have. So what is the role of a competition regulatory authority? It's to protect the consumers. It's about fair practices in the business. It's about which mall should open, which one is an arcade, which one is not arcade, which business is being bought, and therefore which one is not being bought 100% monopoly, who's monopolizing even, So you have some of the gaps which are glaring that you need to fix. Because for you to say don't take money outside, and yet you are the biggest telecom company in this country, you are owned maybe globally, how will you regulate or attract investors? So you have to say, okay, you must enlist, you must be on the stock market, so the public own a stake in you, so that you are not super big and yet not owned by Ugandans. And therefore, it caps on how much you're going to take out of your company coffers. So a competition regulatory authority maps out the legal landscape and operational landscape for fair business practices within companies also, but also to the consumers. For example, I'll give you today, the price of matoke in Barara, where I come from, in Wizwera, is 500 shillings. A big bunch which is taller than me, 500 shillings, farm gate price. But here, yes, 500 shillings. Come here to the market, you'll buy it 20,000 shillings. Sincerely speaking, even if it came by, I don't know, a turtle or a tortoise, carried it up to here, would you charge that much money? That's very unfair. Someone somewhere is being ripped off, and it's a farmer. Who is supposed to look at this? It's a competition regulatory authority. So we need one. But I'm also aware that the Ministry of Finance is working on this law. Probably it is needed today than yesterday. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That authority should have come yesterday. Who should we press on? Because, I mean, this discussion is just not going to end here. Who do we press to ensure that this comes into play?
Is the Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. And that is the one which has the competitive strategy, it has a competitive enterprise. It was even giving grants to corporate, startups. Which
Or is it also going to be an aspect of money that it is not coming into play?
I do not want to go that far, and I don't think it will be just like any other. But there is urgent call for intervention in the way economy is administered and governed. You see, Uganda is moving towards the caring economy. A caring economy is that, yes, for such a long time we have been investing in physical infrastructure. Honorable Wanika here has told you that, yes, we've been putting money in the infrastructure and we are committed. But what about social infrastructure? What about the human person at the center of all this? Are we going to eat the highways? For how long are we going to eat the highways?
Yes.
Okay, given this is the time now to look at the person, the individual person in the whole mix-up and say, how do we put money in this person? Money, how do we monetize the economy? For example, how do we create instruments where people can identify with themselves as secure participants in the development process? And this is one, through comprehensive universal social protection schemes, like I talked about before, social impact bonds, where Honorable here, if he wants reparation, if I have my money as a philanthropist and I want to restore the swamps in Wakiso, I shouldn't be chased away. The NEMA will chase away, local government will chase away. Why are you refilling this? But I have, so this social impact bond helps you to come and say, Wakiso, I want to restore these swamps, and there is an avenue for me to do that. I want to construct this road. I want to construct this hospital. The impact bond is that you should take over and manage it. Oh, I'm going to retool it. So these are avenues that creates active participation in the economy by different stakeholders. But finally, I wanted to say one thing, that you see, Uganda has over 14 million informal workers, okay, in the informal sector. And all these, it's the biggest employing agency. But unfortunately, you can't easily trace them at any one moment. They are not registered, but they are, all your bungalows around here, Kampala, you source your products from someone on the road, you won't ask, where is the license? Are you registered metal worker? Come and measure my house. They measure and they supply you. You pay a lot of money, by the way. They make a lot of money.
Yes.
Why are they not getting on the formal registry? Because we lack incentives for the informal sector to formalize.
Thank you.
And when that happens...
We are looking at formalization for taxes.
Exactly. When you formalize, the tax base increases, insurance increases, better employment conditions increase. Better consumption of electricity and other services increase. Universal, a lot of things grow up. So we need to create incentives for boosting the informal sector so that they can formalize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Ruth, you wanted to add something to the discussion, but also I would want to task you as Uganda Human Rights Commission, how much work are you doing to ensure that you monitor, have this business comply with the existing laws and respect human rights as well?
I'll start from where Bernard and Honorable Wanika left off. And I just want to add that as a country, we are emphasizing so much on collection of revenue. And so there's so much taxes. And if you listen to the plight of and the complaints of businesses, they're all complaining about taxes. But as a country, we haven't looked at how do we support these companies to grow. So I have a friend who has a small hotel, and he was telling me, can you imagine, I have not been working for the last 4 or 5 months, and the other day I received a notice that I have to pay taxes. From where? So, and everyone is really bringing out their frustration of the taxes that are being collected. And he was saying, where was government to support me when I was building? When, the cement is very expensive, the sand is expensive, the stones are very expensive, no one questions, no one talks about the prices of these things. And yet, once you're done and you start something, they are busy collecting. So as a country, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Finance, we have to look at how do we protect our businesses. And what kind of businesses do we have in the country? The other day, the president raised something very important, that most of our businesses are running on Chinese products. how do we as a country invest in innovation so that we innovate our own products so that we can sell to other countries. That way, we cut the cost of running to Dubai and other people will be coming into the country. We increase our revenue in various ways. Instead of squeezing every little businesses, and as such, they struggle, they cannot employ, and so when you have something like COVID-19, there are many out. You ask about how the Commission is monitoring businesses. Now, when we look at businesses, they have a duty to respect. They have a duty to respect the people they work with. They have a duty to respect the law. They have a duty to respect the policies of government with regard to environment and everything. Now, the Uganda Human Rights Commission monitors the human rights compliance with regard to businesses. So we monitor how the workers are being treated. We receive complaints on where their rights are abused. We monitor whether they are protected. Do they have safety gear? Is there environmental hazards? Okay. Are they exposed to toxic chemicals that may affect their right to health? You employing children such that the right to education is affected, the right to livelihood? What is the pay? Is it adequately paid and paid on time? So we monitor, we go in and we go in and monitor that. However, that is not sufficient. We have to work with the Uganda Investment Authority, which is the company or the institution that is responsible to invite investors into Uganda. They need to do a background check onto the people who come into our country, the investors who come into our country. Have they violated rights elsewhere? If they have no business to be in Uganda because they will exploit Ugandans further. Where do they put their investments? Uganda Investment Authority should do this. The Ministry of Trade should be able to have an oversight role over the businesses in Uganda. Who is exploiting who? Who is doing what? NEMA has a role to ensure that the environment is protected and that there's no pollution. We have seen companies that come up with a NEMA certificate, but when you get to the ground, there's a lot of pollution. We have received complaints of stone quarries, for example, where women have complained of getting miscarriages, the noise pollution when they are blasting the stones, and then the dust, okay, that is made by many of these companies. And the companies come out and they show you a NEMA certificate, but there are human rights issues involved. There are children who are dying or getting sick because of some of these effects. And so we are saying the Uganda Human Rights Commission can't do it alone. We need all actors, all government institutions to come on board so that we do something that is holistic, whether it is environment, whether it is the health, whether it is regard to employees' rights, so that we are able to protect the Ugandan, and you and I can live and work in a better place.
Thank you very much. And Ruth, to loop into your discussion, I want to come to Mr. Matia Bwanika. How has been your experience dealing with some of these businesses that degrade the environment? Because like Ruth has explained, yes, it's one thing for you to show me the certificates of compliance coming in from NEMA, but what's the action on ground and what's the kind of relationship between the certificate and its expectations and what's exactly on ground?
Environmental degradation is a real catastrophe. Because one thing I can ably tell you is that those who are degrading the environment are very powerful, highly informed, very rich, highly connected, name it. You see, previously we had those who were degrading the environment for survival, and their degradation magnitude was very minimal. You would find someone building a makeshift, mud house in a swamp. Just one season of rain, it could go. He or she plants some yams, sugar canes, and so on. And in any case, whatever she or he does in the environmental, environment does not stop the water flow, the ecological, whatever, and everything. But now here comes a so-called investor. Normally they begin around 5 o'clock on Friday with the trucks. about 100 Sinotracks.
Because you're not working over the
Yes,
weekend.
they fetch Maram 10 kilometers or 20, meaning that they have resources. And to tell you what, when you are, someone informs you, you'll find every truck with a policeman and a gun. Guarding and escorting those trucks. You see, you can't imagine with this kind of espionage of VISO, GISO, DISO, PISO and everything. How could such an illegality happen without, that is one. Two, I sympathize with NEMA. We have a case near Kajanstown Council where people are still dumping, even now. When I went there to arrest, I found them with a NEMA certificate. And it's a project of, I think, Mr. Anzei is putting up, I think, another soda factory in a swamp there in Kajanstown Council. But they have the environmental impact assessment report and NEMA cleared them. But if you go deep in the details of what is happening, you will sympathize with these people in the NEMA. One, their job security is in the hands of those who are degrading the environment. So now NEMA is there as a scapegoat. Then two, I don't know whether you are aware of the budget of NEMA. As a national agency,
very minimal.
You will find it with 2-3 pickups of the NEMA police for the whole country. They are not facilitated to do their job. That means it's deliberate. So, what I would say on the environmental degradation, that it's, I would only call upon the civil society. One of my discontent, you see, we in government. Yes. You see, a government is a very powerful monster. I can now call a DP and this passes this meeting. That's power.
Yes.
Now there is that lady seated in Nabwe, very powerless. And me, who is very powerful, who can command. I'm now the commander in chief in Wachiso. Okay?
A very huge distance.
Now, the space between that powerless person and government is a stronger civil society. Because it acts as a link.
Okay.
It comes out to, to engage the state. You see, there is that gap which we are failing to fill. And we have left the whole affairs of the state and the country to politicians. And that is very dangerous. Very dangerous. Because, you see, if you look at the percentage of politicians in the country, it cannot even make 1%, depending on the population. We can't make 1% of the population, okay? Even political parties don't make even 5% of the population, all political parties. Yeah? If you look at the people who are suffering from our excesses, are more than enough but powerless. And my argument is, who is there to act as a link? Do you think of parliament which will go to Chankwan's for an evening and, they share some compliments and they come to fight?
It should be civil society.
It should be the civil society to come up strongly to advocate for all nature of rights. And, they will be easily joined by the other powerless lady or gentleman there to come and engage the state, and so that people get what we would call minimum fairness. So that's what I can say about the environmental degradation, and it's quite rampant. No one can tell you that I've tried my level best. A good case in point, during this COVID, they started again sand mining. You see, people are complaining about these water levels. Waters have not decreased their levels. We have infringed on the flow of water. We have dug the sand from the waters. We have spoiled everything. But that Nangombe, the group which is degrading which is sand mining, is direct about 5 kilometers to State House, meaning that it even compromises the security of the president. And you will wonder, how can such illegality, which is even compromising the presidential security, how could it go on without being sensed or being stopped? So these are issues we should ask ourselves. Something fundamental must be addressed.
Okay. Well, very eye-opening, a candid discussion, so to say. Thank you very much, Mr. Matia Lwanga-Bwanika. Our time is really getting fast spent, and yet we would like to continue with this discussion. But maybe for your final notes before I go through each and every one, what are the lessons that the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development has taken in ensuring that you protect the vulnerable, which is a relative discussion as well, because it depends on what situation, and also those who have been affected by any sort of situation. Today it's COVID, the next day it might be floods, the other day it might be mudslides.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, and I've talked about this at different forums, and one of the Rubicon, call it for lack of a better word, the policy framework is social protection policy. And this is the policy which has ushered in the senior citizens grant, the elder, the SAGE, that it has gone universal in the whole country. Even if the age is still high, we are coming down because of the nature of the weight. And then, of course, we are bringing up the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and then we also bring the social accountability, social impact assessment and accountability bill. Now, the stimulus package also brought in some money, around 80 billion shillings on public works program to make sure that they pay the mass employment program for those who are involved in public works, construction of schools, construction of roads, construction of hospitals, make sure they are labor intensive. Okay. And to me, those are deliberate measures that I would want to mention here. The other aspect is that we are all learning from this challenge, and probably we should be coming out as a better institution to address emergency measures. Yeah. Okay, well, that's very good. And maybe just to wind up, Ruth, what are the existent measures or systems in place that one can seek redress as we get to talk about human rights? Because we can't say post-COVID. We are saying post-lockdown for now. COVID is seemingly still with us, and maybe we will feel much more the effects in the long run. Okay, when we're talking about remedies, there are legal and non-legal remedies, and persons can go to courts of law and petition court. They can use the Uganda Human Rights Commission. They can use the Equal Opportunities Commission in the event that there are issues of discrimination. However, there are non-judicial mechanisms that they can use. And these involves traditional leaders. You'd be amazed at what they can do. They involve local councils who mediate matters. Okay. These non-judicial are very popular with communities out there, particularly in rural communities, because most people cannot afford the fees, the court fees. Litigation is very expensive in Uganda. Hiring a lawyer is crazy, is very expensive. But they can walk into any of our offices at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Okay. And we have 10 regional offices and 10 field offices. In any of our offices, we also have toll-free lines. They can call any of those. If you Google or through our 23 offices in the country, you should be able to access a remedy or even get advice on how appropriate and how best to handle your matter appropriately. Thank you, Ruth. In just a few seconds, Mr. Matia Lwanga-Bwanika, what needs to be done out of the discussion on human rights, protection of the environment and everything? What are the lessons? Where do we need to go?
Of course, it must be a paradigm shift. It begins with us as individuals from our homes to change the mindset. That I don't care attitude is very rampant, especially among the elite. The elite, once they get their, end of month check, they go home, they shop from supermarkets. If it is not COVID, if he or she can afford to take his or her kid to Namagunga, Gayazandibudo, then the rest, I don't care. It's a very big problem. That's why I said maybe something fundamentally wrong is happening in our country. Okay. It's that we need to have that shift of this country belongs to us all. Something must be done. Let us desist that notion of saying that it's the politicians to do this or that. In any case, politics is now demystified. In fact, I doubt whether in Uganda we still have honorables. It is just a mockery, someone to call you honorable. You see, if you go by its true definition and meaning.
Oh, yes.
So, I would suggest that there must be something fundamentally, I don't know, there must be a shift. It begins with individuals in our homes, then it goes to our villages, our societies, our communities, then it goes from different sectors, different, trades. Then we look at means of changing the entire country, because I can't, because where do you give a credit in Uganda? In what sector? What can you say that, we are doing well in transport?
That is very tight.
Yes.
His Excellency the President really has controlled the corona.
Where do you
The corona,
It's not a court. It's okay. It's not a court. Ms. Salima, I'll give you the last 2 minutes to wind up. What's the way forward with regard to the discussion of economic recovery, but putting human rights into perspective?
Okay, as the conversation came in later with Mr. Bwanika describing the entities we are dealing with, many of the businesses that do violate human rights are powerful entities. So individuals will need the support of the state in order to tackle these powerful entities. And the state has to show a willingness at the political level to regulate these businesses, because we're in a state where investors are taken as priority and people's rights are taken as secondary as long as we attract investors. But if the state doesn't change that attitude, it will become very difficult for anybody to make companies accountable. Yeah. But also, we've seen that this whole idea of market-driven growth doesn't work. We've seen that even a country like the United States, which is arguably the most liberal marketized economy, where people used to argue they don't need the state, they've realized that actually they need the state. When COVID-19 came, everybody's rushing to the federal government. So in a society that is highly unequal, like what we have in Uganda, state stewardship has to be very strong. Sure. It has to start with political will. There has to be enough regulatory framework, which framework is actually implemented. And now in the regulations, you also have to empower the people. Where you're facing people like the big companies that are powerful, empower people, for example, by having a requirement of free, prior and informed consent of communities. If you're coming to do sand mining, if you're coming to mine or drill oil in a neighborhood, we must have a say in terms of what is happening. But also, there must be laws that promote transparency, where the state has control and is able to monitor the income of the various business entities, yes, and is able to know if, for example, there is a leakage in terms of illicit financial flows. The state has to have a mechanism of doing that. If an entity is under-declaring its profit for purposes of cutting the taxes they have to pay, the state has to be willing, but also has to set up itself to be able to monitor that. And lastly, for me, it will be the issue of access to remedy. And I've mentioned this earlier. The institutions that are helpful in issues of access to remedy, like the judicial, the quasi-judicial entities, they have to be adequately facilitated to be able to play this role, but also be deliberate about balancing the cases that are coming through. Sure. You don't only focus on cases that are coming through to resolve a conflict between two MPs, instead of resolving a conflict that involves a whole community that has been evicted and they are living in destitution for years. And you're busy sorting out two politicians. We have to be deliberate about this. And until we do that, people will always remain vulnerable, and businesses will first become bigger than the state, and we shall have a situation that is not manageable.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you, Mr. Mjuni. Thank you very much, Salima and ISER, for ensuring that this discussion comes to play. And thank you very much, Mr. Matia Bwanika, for being always candid. I've known you for being very candid. And what comes out clearly is that on the road to economic recovery, and the fact that we need to be getting out of all the negative effects of COVID-19, there is human rights that is at stake, and we need to protect human rights. And also remember, that there are pre-existent laws that we need to focus on to ensure that human rights is very, very much key and at the forefront of this economic recovery. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. I mean, we could have wanted much more time to explore on this, but time is our greatest enemy. But let's continue the discussion online and on all our social media platforms. It's been a great deliberation, and we know that we'll continue to work with ISER to ensure that such great discussions come to the foreplay. Thank you for watching NBS Television. We'll take a break off now and get back to normal programming. I'm Mildred Tohaise. Have a good evening and God bless.